Scioria was burning. A number of important buildings had been leveled to the ground by the initial artillery exchange, and several sections of the city were ablaze with sapient fire that deliberately sought to burn as much of the city as possible. The invading soldiers did not help matters, as they had a tendency to set buildings ablaze unless there were defending forces to stop them from running amok. Despite this, Zorian felt the situation was actually pretty good. Based on the previous invasions he had witnessed in the time loop, he had expected the city to suffer far more than it had so far. The city leadership was extremely quick to react and organize itself, despite the fact that the city hall and main barracks got totally destroyed early on, and the defending forces were far better equipped than he remembered. This was only partially the result of Zack and Zorian's machinations. It seemed that despite the two sides' agreement to keep things relatively secret and low-key, some awareness of what was happening still ended up trickling down to Scioria's authorities. That was good. Zack and Zorian had more important battles to fight, and couldn't afford to come to the aid of the city at this time. It was up to the city itself to douse the fires before they went out of control, and repulse the invaders pouring out of tunnels beneath the city. Was it cold-hearted of them to leave Scioria entirely to its own devices in a time like this? A little. However, Zorian firmly believed that what they were doing was the best way to minimize the number of casualties. Getting involved in the city fighting would no doubt cause Quadakikl and other invasion leaders to make their own appearance there as well. It was not in the interest of Scioria and its inhabitants to have a bunch of ultra-powerful mages duking it out in the city streets. No, it was far better to go on the offense against the invaders and force the high-level mage fights to happen elsewhere. Somewhere where the invaders would have to worry about collateral damage. This was why one of Zorian's simulacrums was leading a force composed of golems, Alanix recruits, and mind-controlled monsters straight towards the Abasin underground base. The base held the dimensional gate through which the Abasin forces intended to retreat once their goals had been achieved, which meant it had to be held at all costs. Thus, the moment the invaders realized there was a powerful army heading towards their retreat point, they had no choice but to redirect most of their forces to try and stop them. The defenders on the surface probably didn't realize this, but they were fighting a mere fraction of the invading enemies, because most of them were currently busy fighting Zorian's army in the tunnels below. Well, the original Zorian was busy with other matters entirely, so it was more accurate to say they were fighting an army led by his simulacrum, but on this particular day, it hardly mattered. Zorian and his simulacrums were truly one, their minds fused together to an unprecedented degree. He felt less like a man with a couple of copies running around, and more like a single mind controlling multiple bodies. It was the culmination of all his research into the way Princess and the cephalic rat swarms functioned, and he previously did not dare use it outside of a testing chamber. He was afraid of such magic warping his personality and sense of self, especially if used on a regular basis, but desperate times called for desperate measures. It should be safe to use it just this once. Hopefully. Currently, Zorian's simulacrum body advanced confidently towards the mass of enemies blocking the nearby tunnel entrance, unintimidated by their attempt at setting up a blockade. His army, composed of several hundred golems of various sizes, almost 100 mages that Alanik recruited for their cause, and several hundred hook goblins and other dungeon denizens, swarmed behind him, waiting for orders. A pair of shining projectiles, one red, one blue, came flying at him from the enemy barricade ahead. They shone so bright they were painful to look at, as their flight created a startlingly loud screaming sound as they homed in on Zorian. He did not even bother to defend himself, it would be a waste of his limited mana. The huge bodyguard golem that never left his side raised its massive hands in front of Zorian and slapped down the incoming spells like a pair of annoying flies. They exploded into a pair of blinding explosions that somehow strengthened and reinforced each other, becoming stronger than the sum of their parts, but it simply wasn't enough. The defensive wards of the massive bodyguard golem harmlessly neutralized the blast, leaving Zorian completely untouched. The golem was left without so much as a scratch, as well. Without saying anything, and before the explosion was even fully over, Zorian pointed the huge magical rifle in his hands at one of the mages that launched the attack and fired. The bullet reached the target at supersonic speeds, effortlessly punching through the defensive wards the Abasins put on their little barricade, hitting the enemy mage in the chest before he could put up any sort of defense. It wasn't a killing blow, but the mage was out of the fight for the foreseeable future, so it might as well have been. Zorian coldly turned his rifle towards the other mage responsible for the attack, ignoring the barrage of spells coming his way or the target's frantic attempts to coat himself in as many shielding spells as humanly possible. More than a dozen nearby golems suddenly turned towards Zorian's target, pointing their own heavy rifles at him in a single, synchronized motion. The mage's shields blocked the first 5 bullets. Then the other 10 or so tore into him and killed him on the spot. As for the barrage of weak spells that was meant to distract him, it was unceremoniously blocked by a bunch of heavily built golems that stepped up in front of him to soak them up with their tough bodies and well-made defensive wards. Zorian gave them a thought, and a screeching swarm of hook goblins, giant centipedes, and cave lizards surged forward and charged the enemy position. The enemy responded by sending hordes of skeletons and zombies forward, and the two groups of expendable meat shields crashed against each other in the middle of the battlefield, attempting to overpower the other. However, it quickly became obvious that the undead were losing. They may have been fearless, but they were ultimately just a mindless mob. Zorian's monster swarm, on the other hand, was more advanced than it appeared. This wasn't the first time Zorian used mind-controlled monsters as meat shields and shock troopers like this, and his methods had evolved greatly over time. His monsters no longer mindlessly charged forward, getting into each other's way and spreading their attacks thin over the entire battlefield, like they did in the past. Instead, they worked together like a cephalic rat swarm, sharing senses, focusing attacks on perceived weak points, ganging up on tough opponents, and sacrificing themselves for the good of the whole if necessary. Suddenly, Zorian sensed 10 mental and soul signatures rapidly moving towards them from all sides, invisibly tunneling towards the back of his army through solid stone. Rock worms. Zorian scoffed inwardly and telepathically ordered the rest of the army to advance forward. The golems mindlessly obeyed, of course, but some of Alanic's human volunteers visibly flinched at the mental command, still unused to this form of communication and a little fearful of him. They did obey in the end, though, and this was all that mattered. He had avoided using them so far, both because he was trying to preserve their strength for a battle that really mattered and because he was still very uncomfortable with ordering people into battles where some of them were guaranteed to die. Unlike the mindless golems and the animal-level monsters that made up the rest of his army, the human mages and soldiers were not expendable. The Abasins in front of them sent out war trolls to charge out and meet them, probably hoping to capitalize on the moment of shock when the rock worms suddenly burst out of the ground and attacked them. That wouldn't be happening, of course. Silver Lake must have informed Jornak about Zorian's potent mind magic capabilities, but either the information never trickled down to the people commanding the troops or they dismissed them as ridiculous, or else they would never dare use a ploy like this against him. It happened in an instant. The charging line of war trolls was only moments away from crashing into the line of battle golems in front of them, perfectly synchronized with the tunneling rock worms that were just about to emerge in the middle of Zorian's army. Whoever was commanding the situation really knew how to arrange things to deal the maximum amount of damage and confusion in an enemy, and Zorian could literally sense the glee and anticipation in the minds of Abasin mages as they waited with bated breaths for the inevitable catastrophe to befall the enemy. And then Zorian suddenly reached out to the 10 approaching rock worms with his mind, tearing through the Abasin mind control schemes like they were made of cobwebs, and commanded them to switch targets. And so they did. Just before the golems and war trolls were about to clash, 8 of the rock worms burst out of the floor and ceiling, tackling the biggest, meanest-looking trolls to the ground and breaking their momentum. When the two groups finally met, the war troll regiment immediately crumbled before the pitiless advance of metal puppets. Tougher than steel and armed with scorching hot blades specifically designed to neutralize the trolls' natural regeneration, the golems wouldn't have had an issue even without the rock worms' help. With them distracting the leaders of the war trolls regiment, the war trolls had no chance. Zorian kept advancing forward. In fact, he had never stopped doing so. As he got closer to the battle between the golems and war trolls, one of the war troll leaders stumbled in close to him, a rock worm stubbornly wrapped around him like a giant snake. The rock worm kept snapping its massive jaws at the war troll's face, while the war troll used both hands to desperately keep it at bay. Zorian gave a command to his huge bodyguard golem, and the metal puppet reached down with one of its massive hands, grabbed the war troll by its left leg and picked it up in the air. The rock worm immediately let go of the troll and found another target to menace, as the massive golem started to spin the war troll above its head a few times and then hurled it straight at the barricade that the Abasins had set up in Zorian's path. It wouldn't have been a very effective attack normally, but the Abasins were a bit busy at the moment. The last two rock worms that Zorian didn't send after the war trolls were instead pointed at the mages normally responsible for commanding them. Additionally, Zorian's monster horde had mostly dismembered the undead chaff sent to stop them and were currently attacking every available weak point of the barricade in the attempt to break through. As such, they could do nothing but watch as their own war trolls, large even by troll standards and clad in heavy steel armor, spun through the air and physically slammed into the boxy stone cube that served as the core of the barricade's defensive wards. The cube shattered into hundreds of pieces, and the wards covering the fortification immediately went down with it. Without breaking his stride, Zorian retrieved a bulky grenade launcher gun from his back and fired 3 frost grenades straight into the biggest clumps of Abasin mages he could see. Barely a moment afterwards, his human underlings joined him in the attack, unwilling to let such an obvious opportunity go to waste, and a wave of energy spells, bullets, and grenades came raining down on the Abasins. Demoralized by their repeated failures, the Abasin forces abandoned their blockade and ran. Zorian was about to command his forces to give chase and thin down their forces when a familiar figure materialized in the air in front of him. It was a floating humanoid wearing a scarlet-red robe, his face hidden beneath a hood that masked his features under a veil of darkness. Even after unmasking himself to them, Jornak still used his red robe outfit to face them. "You were hiding your abilities when we fought earlier," said Jornak, idly blocking a handful of bullets Zorian's soldiers had fired at him while simultaneously firing a streak of lightning back at them. The lightning line hit the first target in an instant, killing him on the spot, before arcing from target to target 5 more times, claiming 3 more lives and disabling 2 more. Zorian immediately ordered them all to withdraw. They might have held some usefulness as a distraction, but they would have to die in droves to achieve that, and he didn't want that on his soul. The Jornak in front of him was just a simulacrum anyway, so it wasn't like they would accomplish much by putting him down. "We both hid our true abilities," Zorian told him, firing a few rounds from his rifle at the floating figure without missing a beat. Jornak blocked them just as easily as he did the bullets from before, looking completely unconcerned. Some kind of shield specialized in defending against physical attacks like bullets. "There is nothing strange or unexpected about that. I really hate those things," Jornak commented. Zorian was pretty sure he was talking about the rifle in his hands. "They caused so much grief and suffering. I wish they were never invented. I'd certainly never use one of those unless I had no choice. I believe Zack feels the same. That's why it surprised me so much when you used one against me the first time we fought. In a way, you're even more honorless than I am." Zorian did not feel like being lectured to by someone like Jornak, so he simply ordered his golems to attack and prepared to cast a spell. He didn't think the man was really here for a philosophical discussion anyway. He probably just wanted to stall Zorian with pointless talk while the enemy forces converged together and regrouped. Almost simultaneously, both of them hasted themselves in an attempt to catch each other off guard and let loose 3 spells each. The walls of the tunnels around them instantly melted, warped, and shattered. They were both unharmed for it. A faint shockwave of the clash propagated itself to the spot where Zorian's human army had retreated, prompting them to fearfully retreat even further. Zorian frowned, looking at the red-robed figure in front of him. Truthfully, he had known something like this would happen when he started this attack. He would have been seriously worried if someone hadn't shown up to stop him, since he would soon be approaching the Abasin base. Their enemies had to stop him before he could shut down the dimensional portal they used to shuffle their forces from place to place. Without it, the invasion was finished before it even began. The trouble was, the original was already fighting elsewhere, and that fight was way more important than this one. This was also the reason why the only serious opposition their enemies had sent to stop him was one of Jornak's simulacrums. They were already pressed elsewhere and couldn't spare anyone else. Truthfully, this whole operation was a bit of a deliberate distraction. He had never really expected to take the Abasin base, because most of their forces were busy elsewhere. His main purpose was to lessen the pressure on the city and to threaten the Abasin retreat point to the point where they would be forced to send someone important to defend it. Both of the goals had been pretty much achieved. The very fact that Jornak had been forced to send one of his simulacrums and waste his mana on this was a success. At this point, it would serve his purposes just fine to simply drag this fight out as much as possible, wasting Jornak's mana and preventing him from fully committing elsewhere. Or he could take a risk and try to eliminate the simulacrum for real, something that would force the enemy to shift even more resources to this conflict, but had a high chance of blowing up in his face if his simulacrum ended up being destroyed in the clash. All of the human recruits that followed him to this place would die soon afterwards, and the Abasins would once again be free to focus their effort on the city above. The indecision only lasted for a moment. He swiftly ordered his golem army into motion and then created a swarm of tiny projectiles around him. Each one was smaller than his thumb and glowed with bright orange light, circling around him like a river of stars. Though seemingly weak, each of the little orange stars contained the force of a fully powered fireball. They were fast, maneuverable, and Zorian could hold them in reserve until he needed them. He immediately sent 3 of them at Jornak on curved, complicated trajectories and then followed them up with a lance of force aimed straight at his head. Jornak's reaction to the small army of golems trying to tackle him surprised Zorian, however. Rather than use magic to evade them or waste a huge amount of mana to batter their spell-resistant bodies, he simply punched them away. The simulacrum Jornak sent here was clearly special in some way that Zorian did not understand, because he possessed downright incomprehensible physical strength. His mere punches sent man-sized golems flying away like discarded dolls, and a well-placed kick could easily snap a knee joint and render the golem useless. Worse, Jornak's simulacrum seemed able to regenerate its ectoplasmic body with minimal effort on his part. Twice Zorian managed to severely damage him, blowing off his arm once and piercing a big hole with a force lance in his torso the other time, and in both cases the damage went away in mere seconds. Zorian ordered his bodyguard golem to join the fray, hoping to use its size and powerful wards to simply overpower Jornak with raw strength, but this quickly backfired. Jornak took out 3 grenades from his pocket and threw them above his head before teleporting out of the huge golem's reach. Before Zorian could order it to withdraw, the grenades detonated without the slightest sound. A web of hair-thin dimensional fractures flashed faintly in the air, space itself shattering before the magical grenade blast, and enveloped the golem. As potent as the great golem's defenses were, very few things could stand up to the cutting power of dimensional fractures. The thin black lines went through the golem's bulk with hardly any resistance, snuffing out its animation core and cutting up its bulk into hundreds of tiny pieces. Zorian could only helplessly watch as his creation, one which had been crucial in his coming this far so easily, fell apart in front of his eyes. Okay, now he was kind of angry. He launched all of the fire stars he had circling him straight at Jornak's simulacrum, forcing him onto the defensive, and then physically charged straight at him. The enemy simulacrum hesitated for a second, no doubt wondering what had possessed Zorian to do something that stupid, before deciding this was too good of a chance to pass up. He charged as well, rushing to meet Zorian head-on. Jornak's simulacrum was clearly far more powerful up close than Zorian's. Just before they slammed into each other, Jornak's whole body became shrouded in arcing red electricity that reminded Zorian of Quatakikle's favorite spell. In a blindingly fast movement, Jornak's hand flashed forward and punched straight through the chest of Zorian simulacrum. Despite being made out of metal and alchemically treated materials, his body provided very little resistance before the ectoplasmic hand, which passed through him like a very sharp blade. Damaging red lightning immediately began spreading itself through the chest cavity of the simulacrum, irreparably damaging sensitive components. Zorian ignored the damage. Instead, he reached out with both hands and firmly gripped the hand sticking out of his chest. Realizing that something was wrong, Jornak's simulacrum tried to wrench its hand free of the grasp, but he wasn't fast enough. Hundreds of mana threads erupted out of Zorian's palms, burrowing themselves into Jornak's ectoplasmic flesh. Jornak's simulacrum shuddered and twitched as it tried to move, but failed to wrench itself out of Zorian's grasp. Even as Zorian's chest started to flake off around the hand stuck in it, internal components seeping out as fine black sand, Jornak's own form was getting blurrier and more indistinct. Moreover, the degradation of Jornak's simulacrum was clearly progressing faster than that of Zorian's own puppet body, more and more mana threads spreading throughout its ectoplasmic form and disrupting it on a fundamental level. "You," Jornak croaked incredulously, before his entire body, red cloak and all, warped and flickered like a badly made illusion and collapsed into smoke. Zorian's own simulacrum body then promptly collapsed on the floor, now that Jornak's hand was no longer keeping his body standing. His internals were far too ruined for him to move his limbs anymore, and just about the only thing he could still move was his head. Eventually, the human soldiers under his command decided to check things out and cautiously approached the place of the battle. "Hey," Zorian suddenly called out from the ground, where his crumpled simulacrum body lay motionless. A bunch of people looked at themselves before the closest soldier pointed to himself curiously. "Yeah, you with the beard. Cut off my head." "I beg your pardon?" the man asked, shocked. "I can't move my body, so it's mostly just useless weight at this point. Sadly, none of my golems are too good at fine manual dexterity, so it's up to you to cut off my head and carry it with you. You'll be my official head carrier from now on." The man gave the body on the floor a strange look before sighing. "This is not what I signed up for," he mumbled under his breath. At the same time, one Zorian was fighting in the tunnels beneath Scioria, but he was also in Koth, preparing to participate in the assault on the Abasin base there. Jornak had made a portal link to Koth earlier in the month, in order to eventually take Zorian's friends and family hostage, and now there was a small Abasin base hidden out there in the jungle, relatively close to the Terramachula estate. Zorian couldn't tell if Jornak still placed any hopes on this plan. On one hand, the base was still there and the portal connection was not shut down. Surely their enemies would not have done this if they knew that Zorian had opted out of using the Terramachula estate as his sanctuary. On the other hand, the base looked pretty small and understaffed to Zorian's eyes. Just a single regiment of war trolls and a small horde of undead, led by a handful of human mages. This was a pretty half-hearted operation. Or that's what he thought, anyway. Orisa and the other Terramachula around him apparently did not share his sentiments. "What a nasty surprise these people had planned for us. This would have been a disaster if the attackers had caught us off guard," Orisa commented. "I've seen you fight," Zorian said, frowning. "A house with several dozen mages like you should have no problems repulsing a force like this, even if the war trolls and undead are more resistant to be attacks than most targets." Since most of their attention was placed elsewhere, Zorian was here only as a simulacrum. Moreover, he did not have an army of golems with him like the simulacrum beneath Scioria did. He was here more as an advisor than anything. The Terramachula would be the ones who did all the fighting. "You did?" Orisa asked curiously. "How strange. I don't remember fighting anyone while you were around. Still, while I thank you for the compliments, the simple counterpoint to your claim is that our house doesn't have several dozen mages like me. I am very much exceptional, both in talent and the amount of resources that have been spent on me. Most of the members of our house aren't particularly good at fighting to begin with. Most of them are primarily trackers and surveyors, using their bees purely to find things and fighting only as a last resort." "Ah," said Zorian, wincing a little internally. Yes, he probably shouldn't take someone like Orissa to be the benchmark for your average member of the house. So why did you insist on making this attack, then? Why not just defend your estate like I advised you to? There is too much risk involved in that, Orissa said. If our main hives are damaged in the fighting, it would be a huge blow to our operations. But more importantly, the elders want that portal. Zorian raised his eyebrow at her. The portal, of course. The base Jornak made for this operation connected Koth directly to Altazia, bridging the vast distances between two continents with a permanent dimensional connection. The value of this was incalculable. And you think you can take out this force, which you aren't sure you could defend against effectively, in such a way that you can seize the portal intact? Zorian asked her curiously. There is a chance, yes, Orissa told him with a mysterious smile. In a direct fight, I wouldn't be too confident of my chances, but thanks to your information we have a chance to take them off guard. If we can sneak enough bees into their base without them noticing, then their first indication of an impending attack will consist of getting swarmed by hundreds of magical bees each. You'd have to make sure to get them all or the whole thing will fail, Zorian pointed out. If even one survives the initial attack, he will close the portal. Of course, Orissa said. That's why it's important to be patient and do this slowly. You said there was no rush, yes? None, Zorian admitted. This fight was relatively irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. If the Terramachula could really seize the portal, Zorian supposed they could send in some of their forces to the other side to assist them, but that was unlikely to be decisive in any way. In fact, I wholly support your decision to be careful. Less chance of your needing to pull us out of the fire if we flounder. Orissa asked knowingly. I'm just a moderately talented teenager, Zorian said. I could hardly turn the tide of battle all on my own. Yes, I'm sure, Orissa said. How many living people did you say were in the base? 28, Zorian said with barely a thought. He then quickly pointed out to her where exactly everyone currently was so her forces wouldn't waste time scouting the base for no reason. You know exactly where everyone in that base is, even from this distance, Orissa said lightly. But you're just a moderately talented teenager. Your brother should have taught you how to lie better. It's just a standard mind sense that all psychic people have, Zorian protested. Just an innate ability, nothing more. I'm quite sure that Daimen couldn't replicate what you just did, despite being way older than you, Orissa said. Ugh. Why was he so bad at this look relatively normal thing? This was going to be a real problem in the future, he could already tell. You know what? I'm shutting up now, Zorian sighed. You have a surprise attack to plan, so you should get on that, and I'll just stand on the sidelines and let the adults handle everything from now on. Please protect me, Damon's fiancé. My brother will never forgive you if you get his beloved little brother killed. She set loose some of her bees on him for that. Zorian was in the tunnels beneath Scioria, he was in Koth, and he was even in the academy in Scioria, setting up contingencies in case things failed to develop as they hoped. But mostly he was at Ayaska's mansion. In fact, Zak, Svim, Alanik, Daimen, and most of their forces were also at Ayaska's mansion because that's where the Abasins held their kidnapped shifter children. It was a bit of an obvious choice, in retrospect. It was heavily defended, it was really far from any other civilization, and it had a gate connection to the Abasin base beneath Scioria. However, there had been lots of obvious choices when it came to the place where the Abasins held the shifter children, and the cost of attacking Ayaska Mansion was huge. It wasn't something they would be willing to commit to unless they knew there was something of critical importance there. Well, now they knew, and the mansion and its surroundings had become the site of a bitter battle. Zorian's real body was here, standing on the back of Princess as the forest burned and shuddered around them. Thousands upon thousands of undead were charging at them, ranging from simple undead boars to towering mountains of stitched-up flesh that could rival even the biggest of Zorian's golems in size. Zorian's golems took care of most of them, tearing into them with grenade throwers and dismembering them with giant blades, but there were just too many of them. Fortunately, Princess was unafraid of the horde of the walking dead, and her 8 heads were ever vigilant. Any undead that dared approach her was immediately dealt with, without Zorian having to do anything. Immediately behind the undead horde was a rapidly approaching mass of monsters, mostly war trolls and winter wolves, with a huge swarm of iron beaks hovering above them, cawing ominously. Some rock worms were moving invisibly beneath the surface of the earth, but their controllers were wiser than the ones beneath Scioria and made sure the worms avoided Zorian like a plague and stayed as far away from him as possible. And in the distance, perched on the roof of the mansion, were 3 dragons staring intently at them. 3 living, perfectly healthy dragons, completely unrelated to the skeletal monstrosity hidden in the depths of Ayaska Mansion. Oganj and his 2 students, Zorian was sure. They weren't doing anything for now, but Zorian knew this wouldn't last as they got closer to the mansion itself. The attack was meant to be a surprise, but their enemies had clearly been ready for them anyway. Well, it would have been nice to catch their enemies completely off guard, but he had never really thought this would be an easy battle, anyway. After some back and forth with Zack, Zorian gave a silent signal to the menacing mass of iron beaks in the sky, and suddenly the whole flock swerved to the side as one, before letting loose a massive volley of knife-like feathers at a seemingly empty patch of land. Distant screams filled the air as the mages who were moving there under the cover of invisibility suddenly came under attack by the forces they believed were on their side. Before the enemy mages could regroup, Zorian ordered Princess to charge forward towards the mansion. She did so with relish, but not before letting loose a challenging roar from all 8 of her heads at the trio of dragons in the distance. Clearly riled up by the provocation, one of the dragons shook and almost flew up in the air to intercept her, but the biggest of the dragons casually slapped him down with his tail and gave him a silent glare. Visibly chastised, the smaller dragon immediately backed down. Zorian was impressed. Although Oganj was clearly the biggest and meanest of the trio, the other 2 were still adult dragons. They were not known for accepting such clearly subordinate positions lightly. Oganj must be more than just a good mage if he could convince a pair of adult dragons to follow his orders like that. In any case, Princess was like an 8-headed train that didn't need train tracks to get around. Her great speed and bulk meant that she could simply barrel through the undead horde with minimal resistance, trampling smaller corpses without slowing down and knocking the bigger stuff aside to continue forward. Then Alanik and his fellow mages finished their spell and summoned a fiery twister inside the heart of the undead horde, where it began to suck in the undead towards the center and got increasingly bigger and stronger the more undead it consumed. Zorian had seen that spell before, and now he even knew what the secret behind it was. The fire twister was actually trapping the souls of the undead it consumed and using them to power itself, which was why it seemingly never ran out of mana and only got stronger as it killed more and more undead. It was a rather dark piece of magic by church standards, almost necromantic in the way it functioned, but fighting fire with fire and all that. The fire twister would release the souls it had gathered when the spell eventually ended, letting them move on to the afterlife. Before Zorian could celebrate too much, hundreds of red figures poured out of the mansion, flying into the sky. Zorian squinted at the sight, finding the enemies in front of him unfamiliar. They looked almost like bats, but with disturbingly humanoid bodies and faces, and snake-like tails trailing behind them. The tail had a toothy mouth at the end, Zorian eventually realized, and the tails moved around like they had a mind of their own. Demons, Alanik sent to him through their telepathic link. Minor or major? Zorian asked. There is no such thing as a minor demon, Alanik answered him. But I suppose these would count as minor. Zorian clacked his tongue. Sadly, due to the way the time loop functioned, he had no experience at all in how to fight something like this. All he knew was that demons were an incredibly diverse bunch, with many strange powers that sometimes varied from individual to individual, never mind different species. Fighting them was almost as bad as fighting a human mage. You never really knew what to expect. Let us handle them, another voice demanded over the telepathic link. Zorian didn't argue, he gave his permission and a swarm of Solrotham suddenly rose into the sky with a terrible buzzing sound and flew off to intercept the demon bats. For a while, Zorian busied himself with guiding several severing discs and decapitating war trolls and winter wolves while Princess trampled everything in her path, but gradually things began to bother him. Things were going pretty good, but he couldn't help but feel that this was because the mansion defenders weren't really giving their all to stop them. They were just sending disposable troops to buy themselves more time for something. The fact Augange and his 2 students were just sitting there on the mansion roof and watching the battle with seemingly no intention to get involved was especially bothering him. Why were the freaking dragons not attacking? Hell, they hadn't even sent the skeletal dragon into the fray. He nervously fingered the cube given to him by the angel he summoned, wondering if he should. No, this wasn't the right time. Using it now would be a mistake. Something in the back of his mind insisted that this was true. He put the cube back into his jacket pocket and made a quick conversation with Zack, Alanik, and everyone else. Soon, an absolutely massive creature rose into the air in the distance before rapidly approaching. It was the Solrotham holy beast, the massive sandworm that had given them so much trouble when they had tried to fight it. Now it was on their side. Flying on hundreds of translucent butterfly-like wings, the worm made a beeline for the 3 dragons. At the same time, the others also made their own moves. Zorian projected a blast of repelling force in front of Princess, knocking aside some troublesome opponents that had halted her advance, and ordered her to head straight for the mansion and its guardian dragons, damn everything else. Meanwhile, a milky white orb suddenly rose into the air, carrying Zack, Svim, Alanik, and Daimen towards the dragons with incredible speed and agility. The dragons immediately realized they were being targeted, and rose into the air as one. Augange bellowed out something to his 2 students and they each picked their own opponent. The left one went to intercept Zorian and Princess, the right one flew off to engage the massive sandworm in the sky above the mansion. As for Augange, he seemed to have identified Zack's group as the biggest danger out of them all, and thus something he should deal with personally. Zorian was modest enough to admit the dragon mage was probably right. In any case, once Augange decided it was time to fight, he did not hold back in the slightest. Zack's sphere was too fast and maneuverable for the great dragon to dodge it or breathe fire on it, so he instead reached for his magic. Waving his hands in a surprisingly human-like gesture, Augange created an incandescent white sphere in his hand and thrust it in the opposing sphere's general direction. Even though the attack wasn't aimed at him, and he was quite a distance away, Zorian could still feel his neck hairs raise at the amount of mana Augange poured into the spell. Dragon magic was bullshit. Thankfully, all of them were quite unusual in their own way, and Zack had 3 other people supporting him. Before the destructive sphere could actually get close to Zack's sphere and detonate, space started to bend around it, like something invisible was being wrapped around it, and then the sphere seemingly winked out of existence. Moments later, a terrifying detonation sounded in the distance. Svim had teleported Augange's projectile away into a nearby region, but its detonation still sent vibrations through Zorian's chest and lit up the sky like a second sun. Gods, no wonder Zack had died to Augange so many times. How were they even supposed to fight someone like this? Watch out, you stupid savage. Sudamir's voice suddenly echoed all around the mansion, magically amplified and projected so that it could be heard clearly in the whole region. You're lucky they got rid of that projectile or you'd have leveled the whole mansion. Since when is this kind of magic acceptable when you're defending a place? Shut up. Augange yelled back in clear human tongue, his voice just as loud as Sudamir's, despite using no magic to amplify it. I know what I'm doing. Go whine to your dead wife instead of bothering me when I'm fighting. Zorian ignored the bickering between Sudamir and Augange, because he had more immediate issues to worry about. Augange's student was probably not as powerful as his master, but he was still a dragon mage and he was coming for him. Zorian fired a force lance at the incoming dragon's wing, hoping to ground it. Dragon flight was magical, but they still needed their wings intact if they wanted to use it, so wing membranes were a big, well-known weakness. Too well-known, apparently. The dragon tried to swerve out of the way of the force lance, but when Zorian revealed he could make the lance pivot in the middle of flight and change directions on a whim, he found out that the dragon also erected a shield around himself just in case. The force lance hit the shield and shattered harmlessly upon it. Visibly narrowing his eyes at Zorian and Princess, the dragon took a deep breath and launched a stream of fire-based projectiles at them. Apparently this dragon practiced magic that allowed him to shape his breath into various projectiles like exploding fireballs and fast-moving beams of flame. He still couldn't hit Princess. With her 8 heads and her strangely shaped body, she kind of looked like she should be clumsy and slow, but she was a divinely enhanced beast, and this impression was totally wrong. Princess was both fast and maneuverable, and not only did she skillfully dodge every projectile the young dragon mage directed at her, she even found the time to pick up various loose stones and small winter wolves that hadn't moved away fast enough and hurl them straight at the dragon in the air. She was a pretty good shot, too. Plus, of course, she had Zorian riding on her back. Whenever she couldn't dodge something, he would just deflect it away while periodically annoying the dragon with simple force projectiles. He was pretty sure that this was the dragon that had wanted to fight Princess when she had bellowed out a challenge at the start of the battle, so he should be a fairly irritable sort. Annoyingly, the dragon had placed mental shields on itself before the battle had even begun. They weren't much, but dragons were already a pain to affect with his powers, even without dedicated mental defenses, due to their magic resistance. The mental shield, crude as it was, simply made the idea of targeting it with mind magic a complete non-starter. Thankfully, Zorian's hopes about the dragon's irritability proved to be correct. After repeatedly dodging his projectiles and harassing him with force spells, the dragon had apparently had enough. He could have continued flying high, outside of Zorian's and Princess's effective reach, but instead he decided to descend closer to the ground so he could catch them with a more powerful attack. It was a good attack, Zorian had to admit. The dragon created a translucent blue ball in front of him and launched it at the pair. As it got closer, it suddenly extended into a large gelatinous dome and trapped them inside it. Princess tried to bite through it, but the gelatinous barrier resisted her efforts and even glued one of her jaws shut, forcing Zorian to cut her free. Meanwhile, the dragon clearly took time powering up some kind of massive fire spell that would incinerate them both to ashes, now that they were both trapped in a small area with no way to dodge. Unfortunately for him, Princess could teleport. Just before the dragon could release his spell, Princess quickly curled up into a ball and disappeared from her gelatinous prison, taking Zorian with her. Before the dragon could realize what happened, he had already launched the fire attack at the empty dome, wasting his spell and hitting nothing. Then Princess popped into existence practically next to him and Zorian quickly fired a whole bundle of severing whips at the dragon's torso. Being considerably tougher than a human, the dragon mage was not cut into tiny chunks by the severing whips, but they did cut into his flesh, drawing blood and wrapping too tightly around him to be easily dislodged. Especially since any struggle would just worsen his wounds. Zorian anchored the severing whips to Princess's back and ordered her to pull. She did. The dragon let loose an almost girlish scream and plummeted to the ground, severing whips digging ever deeper into his flesh. Before he could gather his bearings, Princess was already upon him, heads biting and snarling, and they both went down in a tangle of limbs and necks. The fight quickly degenerated into a weird but vicious wrestling match, the dragon and divine hydra rolling around the ground, knocking down small trees and smashing boulders into powder. As for Zorian, he had thankfully already jumped off Princess's back when she went after the downed dragon, and was currently flying towards the other 2 dragon fights in a milky white sphere similar to the one that Zack used to confront Ogange. He felt a little bad leaving Princess to fight the dragon on her own, but he had faith she wasn't going to get herself killed in his absence. She was a pretty tough girl. The other 2 fights, he soon realized, were still ongoing. In fact, they had merged into some kind of confused combined battle, thanks to 2 facts. One Ogange student couldn't really stop the flying sandworm. He could keep it busy, but the sandworm was too big and massive for the relatively tiny dragon to stop it from going wherever it wished. Secondly, the Iron Beaks decided, on their own initiative, to pick a fight with the two dragons. Zorian had no idea how that had happened, since picking up a reason from the minds of Iron Beaks itself proved unhelpful. They were just very, very angry and apparently hated the three dragons from the very moment they had shown up and arrogantly claimed the mansion's roof like they owned the whole place. Compared to dragons, the Iron Beaks were nothing. However, there were a lot of them, and they knew when to attack and when to retreat. Moreover, Zack and the others were protecting them, since they found the vicious corvids useful as a distraction. Also, apparently Sudamir really didn't like the fact that his mansion, which contained his beloved wife's spirit, was in danger from all this fighting around it. As such, his voice constantly sounded from the mansion, shouting instructions at the two dragons and insults at Zack and the others. He was starting to sound increasingly incoherent as time went by, and by the time Zorian got close to the battlefield, the man had apparently had enough. The roof of the mansion crumbled and the skeletal dragon hidden inside the top half of it started to pick itself up from the rubble. Ogange gave the skeletal dragon, and the mansion itself, a contemptuous snort, before focusing back on his current fight. Of course, the other combatants wouldn't allow another powerful creature to join the fight like that, so before the skeletal dragon could launch itself into the air, Daimen suddenly materialized a giant ectoplasmic body around himself and tackled it off the roof and into the ground below. Daimen had once used this spell to tangle with Princess, back before they had realized how to take control of her, and now it was being used to restrain Sudamir's skeletal dragon. Sadly, Sudamir was no amateur when it came to building his artificial horrors, and the skeletal dragon wouldn't be so easily restrained. Daimen gave it his best, but it was clear that he was losing and none of the others could afford to turn their back on the other two dragons to give him a hand. But Zorian, who had just arrived on the scene, could. Before the two dragons could react, Zorian reached into the imperial orb that he carried with him and an absolutely massive golem popped into existence. It was 6 meters tall and fully made from gleaming, nigh indestructible metal. The ground sank under its weight as it barreled towards the skeletal dragon being desperately pinned to the ground by Damon's conjured giant. Perhaps it was just Zorian's imagination, but he could almost see an expression of pure panic in the dragon's empty eye sockets just before the metal colossus jumped on top of it and brought down its heavy spiked fists right on top of its skull. Sadly, the moment was slightly ruined by the fact said heavy metal fists didn't shatter the skeletal dragon's skull into tiny fragments with a single blow. Instead, the golem just chipped the skull and ended any hope it had of getting into the air, where its maneuverability would make it a huge threat to everyone on his side. Before Zorian could celebrate and focus on grinding the stupid bone dragon to dust, though, a strange ripple emanated from the mansion, causing both him and everyone else to halt in their tracks. I really hoped this wouldn't be necessary, Sudamir's voice sounded again, this time sounding calmer and more subdued. Shit. Zack suddenly swore over their telepathic connection, and then Zorian's entire perception lurched and twisted. His vision warped, his knees buckled and bile rose to his throat, threatening to make him puke. He immediately recognized the symptoms. It reminded him of a botched teleportation spell, except. He quickly looked around. He was still next to Ayaska Mansion, the Colossus Golem was still holding the skeletal dragon pinned to the ground not far from him, and the iron beaks cawed frantically in the sky above, their synchronized murder flock wobbling chaotically in a disorganized fashion. He was impressed they hadn't dropped from the sky when the dizziness hit them. Beyond Ayaska Mansion, though, Zorian could see a building. A familiar building. And in the distance, he could see burning fires and hear the sound of city defenders facing off against marauding war trolls and hordes of undead. It took him only a moment to realize what had transpired. During the last planar alignment, a group of mages managed to perform an incredible feat of transplanting their city from one continent to another. What Jornak and his allies did was relatively tame in comparison. They had simply switched Ayaska Mansion and its surrounding space with a piece of Scioria. Zorian sighed. He gave a mental order to the Colossus Golem and it brought down its fist once again on the skeletal dragon's skull, this time shattering it to pieces, causing the rest of its bony body to fall limp and lifeless. Despite all their attempts, everything converged back in Scioria in the end. In the sky above, Ogange gave a bellowing roar as the battle began anew. In the middle of Scioria, relatively close to the massive bottomless hole around which the city was built, there was an anomaly. A large mansion sat there like a lonely sentinel, surrounded by trees. No road led to it, and the surrounding forest was far too thick and wild for a city park. The area was perfectly circular, even cutting several buildings in half at the edges, as if someone had switched a portion of the northern forest with a random city district with zero care as to how it would naturally fit inside. Which is exactly what had happened, of course. While Zorian and the others had been fighting the dragons and trying to break into Ayaska Mansion, their enemies had been performing a powerful teleportation ritual to send said mansion straight into the heart of Scioria, right next to the place where the primordial release ritual was to take place. Zorian took a few moments to replenish his mana reserves a little and marveled at the sheer audacity of the feat. He had been curious for a while now why Quadakekal, Silverlake, and Jornak weren't helping their dragon allies defend the mansion. Now he knew. This kind of ritual spell wasn't something that could be done on a whim, or stopped in the middle without consequences. Quadakekal, Jornak, and Silverlake were probably all required to pull this off, and they absolutely couldn't afford to get distracted for even a moment. That's why they got the 3 dragon mages to guard them at this critical time. That's why they were so defensive in general. They should have pushed them harder, Zorian thought to himself regretfully. If they had held nothing back right from the start and tried to break into the mansion with absolutely everything at their disposal, then maybe. He shook his head, putting such thoughts to the side. This was no time for regrets and hypotheticals. Besides, in a way, luck had been on their side. Zorian had not invested too much time studying these kinds of ritual spells, but everything he knew about them told him they had to have started the ritual a long time ago. Long before Zorian had given everyone a signal to start the attack, Jornak and his allies had started casting their spell. If they had moved any slower, it was possible the fight would have started with the mansion's sudden teleportation in the middle of Scioria. Now that would have been a disaster. He observed the battleground around him, trying to figure out his next course of action. Princess had been too far to get caught in the teleportation effect, which meant she was effectively out of the fight. It would take too much time and mana to get her to Scioria, assuming she could even finish her fight with her draconic opponent in a timely manner. The Solrotham's flying sandworm had also been left behind, being far, far too big for the teleportation spell. On the bright side, both of the divine beasts had tied up one of the dragon mages through their efforts. The one princess had been fighting was obviously too far to get teleported, and the second one had been hit by the sandworm and flung into the distance at the time the teleportation effect hit, causing it to be left behind as well. The only dragon mage left now was Ogange, who was currently fighting Zorian's allies in the sky above the mansion. Unfortunately, Ogange was by far the most powerful dragon mage out of the 3. And they were now fighting above a highly populated city, where collateral damage was very much an issue. On the bright side, Zack and his entire group had followed Ogange to Scioria, and they were joined by most of the Iron Beaks and the Solrotham. Zack and the other human mages were currently busy keeping Ogange from leveling the city, but the other 2 were basically unopposed. Under the leadership of their high priest, the devil wasps had thoroughly beaten the demon bats, and were currently just mopping them up. As for the Iron Beaks, they were quickly recovering from their sudden change in scenery and their fighting spirit didn't seem lessened by the experience. Both groups would soon be free to join the other battlefields. Which was good, because a flood of war trolls, various monsters, undead, and enemy mages suddenly started pouring out of Ayaska Mansion. Zorian was not surprised by this. Why else would their enemies bother transporting the entire Ayaska mansion to Scioria unless it was filled to the brim with troops? Still, he was kind of surprised that they managed to keep so many of their forces in reserve like this. The amount of soldiers and monsters they had placed beneath Scioria to fake the main attack wasn't small, and they had also lost a great many of their minions trying to delay them from reaching Ayaska mansion. Jornak and Quatakikl must have been far more active with recruiting than they thought. It wasn't just the Altasian mercenary groups, either. Looking at the enemy forces spreading out into the city, Zorian could see that many of them were of clear Oquin-Abesa origin. Quatakikl must have paid a heavy price to reinforce his existing soldiers with these new ones. This was a risky move by the ancient Lich, Zorian felt. There were too many Abasans here for them to retreat from the city in a timely manner, even with the help of a permanent dimensional gate. The plan was probably for the Abasan forces to retreat the same way they had come in, by retreating to Ayaska mansion and then have it teleported again, this time out of the city. However, this was something that was much easier to disrupt than his original plan, which meant Quatakikl risked losing a lot of forces today. Idly, Zorian wondered how a huge loss in lives and tamed monsters here would reflect on Quatakikl's reputation back on Oquin-Abesa, before deciding this wasn't the time for such thoughts. He directed the iron beaks at these new forces threatening the city, and sent a message to the Solrotham asking them to support them. He received no response from the Solrotham high priest, but the devil wasps did start to fly towards the forces exiting Ayaska mansion, so they had clearly gotten the message. He also sent a signal to the academy. Up until this moment, the academy staff had taken a purely defensive stance and had not gotten involved in the city fighting much, but an improvised combat force had long been gathered and organized. Now that a mass of enemies had materialized practically on their doorstep, the academy was also close to the hole. After all, they also began pouring out and started to actively confront them. As for Zorian, he did nothing to help their allies against the enemy forces running amok in the city. He'd done all he could for them. They would lose or triumph based on their own merits. Instead, he kept replenishing his mana and waited for. They were finally here. Quatakikl, Silverlake, and Jornak. The three of them marched out of Ayaska mansion once the flow of troops leaving their base had slowed down to a trickle, their bearings proud and their steps never faltering. All three of them were as Zorian had come to know them. The ancient Lich was in his skeletal battle form, black bones encased in gold-decorated armor and the imperial crown placed securely on top of his bony head. Sickly green light emanated from him, something that he now knew was a visible trace of a powerful ward anchored to the fancy armor he was wearing. His appearance wasn't just for the sake of appearances and intimidation. Jornak was still dressed in that distinctive red robe he loved to wear, his face hidden in darkness. Truthfully, Zorian still often thought of him as Red Robe in his head, even though he was completely sure of his identity by this point. Finally, Silverlake was looking the most relaxed out of the three, dressed in an expensive red dress, hands clasped behind her back as she was looking around at everything around her. Zorian couldn't really hear her due to the distance between him and their group of three, but she seemed to be quietly humming some kind of tune as she walked. It was hard to connect the beautiful, black-haired woman in front of him with the withered old witch he had come to know in the time loop, but they were clearly one and the same. All three were under the effect of mind blank. Of course. Two more new arrivals also caught his attention. At the same time their three main enemies marched out of the mansion, a large procession of people in robes also left the mansion through another entrance. The lead people were dressed in the same kind of red robe that Jornak was wearing, and guarded tightly in the center of the procession was a large armored carriage that seemed to be shaking from time to time, as if someone was pounding on it from the inside. The group immediately set off in the direction of the hole, barely glancing at the fights occurring around the mansion. The second thing that caught his attention was another Quatakikl. This one was identical to the ancient Lich that had just marched out of the mansion, except this one was holding a glowing red gem the size of a human fist, and was standing directly on top of the ruined roof of Ayaska mansion. Quatakikl was using a simulacrum. How interesting. As far as Zorian could tell, Quadikikl was like Zack, in that he didn't like using those unless he had to. He didn't have the convenient telepathic link to his copies like Zorian did, and he probably worried about what one of his copies would do without his supervision. It was hard enough for Zorian to keep his copies in line, he couldn't imagine how many headaches other people experienced with them. So that probably means. The second Quadikikl raised his black, skeletal hand in the air, his palm pointed at the sky, holding the glowing red gem exposed for all to see. A complicated magic circle made out of blood-red light suddenly sprang up around his position. Red streams of light emanated from the gem like many whip-like tentacles, and the air above the mansion started to twist and distort like hot summer air. Yeah. It was time. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved the angel cube. Then, he deployed the imperial orb and retrieved from it a much bigger, metal cube of his own design. Glancing to the side, he could see Daimen approaching him. His older brother had chosen to stay still for a while after the teleportation event, rather than immediately rejoining Zack and the others in fighting Ogange. He had spent a lot of mana fighting Sudamir's skeletal dragon until Zorian had come, so he probably felt it prudent to take a breather and recover some strength while he could. That thing on the roof is going to summon something, Daimen told him, concern creeping into his voice. Something big. Demons, Zorian said. I know. But look at those three marching towards us. Do you think we can push through them to stop the summoning? Daimen looked at the ancient lich, the humming witch, and the man in the red robe. He didn't know them like Zorian did, but he was a powerful and experienced mage, and could make a decent judgment. He then looked at the battle in the sky, where Zack, Alanik, and Svim were fighting Ogange, and scowled. Their companions were too busy to come to their aid. Can you help me hold them off while I do some summoning of my own? Zorian asked, giving Daimen a brief side glance while focusing on the angel cube in his hands. He had never actually done a summoning like this before. He really hoped he didn't mess things up. That would be really anticlimactic. He swept his hands around him and invisible forces cut deep grooves in the ground around them, forming a complicated magic circle of his own. The lines and glyphs began to glow blue. You won't seriously ask me to fight 3 master mages alone? Daimen asked incredulously. I think you have a very inflated view of my capabilities here, brother. It's fine, Zorian insisted. You just have to hold them off for a little while. Plus, you will have Merva here as support. Zorian pointed at the giant hulking golem standing behind them. Daimen muttered something about Zorian having a stupid naming sense, but the reminder that he had a metal colossus on his side had obviously helped breathe additional confidence into him. Plus, Zorian added, placing his hand on the other, much bigger cube. I won't be completely helpless. Keeping his hand on said cube, Zorian copied Quadakikl's gesture and raised his hand up into the air, palm facing upwards. The small angel cube greedily accepted his mana, interfacing itself with Zorian's improvised magic circle. Hundreds of tiny golden glyphs lit up on the surface of the cube, though from a distance Zorian imagined it just looked like he was holding up a miniature sun in the palm of his hand. A vortex of multicolored light and soft wind suddenly formed around him as the angel cube started to madly draw in ambient mana in the area. A massive, mind-boggling torrent of mana was sucked into the cube, more than Zorian could have ever provided out of his own personal mana reserves, even if he sat there and powered it for several months at the time. Did the angel make the cube specifically to take advantage of Zorian's high shaping skills? Because this was hard. Insanely hard. Other than maybe Svim, Zorian didn't think there was any person other than him that could stop all this mana from running out of control and ruining the titanic summoning ritual the cube wanted to execute. Zorian wasn't entirely sure he could do this himself, actually. The difficulty was still increasing. His hands shook and beads of sweat formed on his forehead as the cube in his palm shone brighter and brighter. An angel's trust is a heavy thing to bear, Zorian lamented in his head. Focused as he was at his task, he was only partially aware of things happening around him, and even that was purely because his mind was fused with so many of his simulacrums. One of the simulacrums took over his body and senses while he focused on shaping the summoning spell, and in his current fused mental state, this allowed him to observe his surroundings in a way he would normally be unable to achieve without being distracted. Almost immediately after he started his own summoning, Jornak, Quadakikl, and Silverlake stopped their dramatic march and just plain rushed at him, hoping to stop the spell. If he hadn't been distracted by the strain of the summoning, Zorian would have found the scene funny. As it was, he just watched as the enemy trio started hurling spells at him, only for them to be stopped cold by Daimen and Merva. Quadakikl did his best to hit him with a multitude of his signature red disintegration beams. Jornak was showering the entire area with blindingly bright arcs of lightning that dodged through any static shield and obstacle in the way, and Silverlake was trying to copy Zorian by launching various potion bottles at him with the aid of telekinetic spells. Nothing worked. Daimen recklessly burned through his mana reserves to erect massive golden shields in front of them, tanking most of the damage, and occasionally dispelled incoming projectiles by hitting them with pale blue beams and invisible waves of disrupting force. Anything that got through him was stopped by Merva, who was tough and warded enough to simply intercept incoming projectiles with his body. Merva also frequently went on the offensive, picking up any rocks and boulders from the craters exposed in the fighting and throwing them with surprisingly good accuracy. He also sometimes suddenly charged at them and tried to stomp them flat, a crude but effective tactic that frequently interrupted their spellcasting and forced them to dodge. In general, the Metal Colossus was far faster and more agile than its looks would suggest. It was no slow, lumbering giant. It was a golem equivalent of a dragon, and Zorian was very pleased it was performing as well as he had hoped. It was just a shame he couldn't figure out how to make Merva fly as well. Something to tackle when he started building version 2 of the Colossus. At some point, Jornak seemed to have had enough of the massive golem, and tried to get rid of Merva the same way his simulacrum had gotten rid of Zorian's bodyguard golem back in the tunnels underneath Scioria. Jornak threw a bunch of bombs at the charging golem and they erupted into a web of hair-thin spatial cracks that enveloped the area. Merva was completely submerged in the spatial cracks, but he emerged completely unscathed. The Metal Colossus was a lot bigger than his bodyguard golems, and had a lot more time and money invested into him. Zorian had equipped Merva with the finest wards he could set up, and it would take more than that to take it apart. Surprised at the fact the golem was still whole and rushing at him, Jornak panicked for a moment and tried to cast a short-range teleport to evade the threat. That was a mistake. One of the wards Zorian placed on Merva was a teleportation ward that could be amplified to extend a fair distance from his body. The ward was a really malicious sort, one that didn't just disrupt the teleportation but also tried to do it in a way that made the spell go haywire and try to kill the caster. Jornak's body shuddered and lurched as his teleportation spell was violently disrupted. He was good enough to stabilize the failing spell, enough that he didn't get himself torn to pieces by the dimensional stresses, but he wasn't good enough to escape all consequences. Dazed and unable to react in time, he was almost stomped by Merva's foot before Quadakikl gestured with his hand and pulled him out of the way of the charging golem. Pity. But no matter. Quadakikl and Silverlake were perfectly lined up at the moment, so Merva thrust both of his hands towards them, causing a huge wave of wind and kinetic force to barrel towards them. Self-casting items were largely disappointing. They could only really produce crude blasts of force, fire and the like. For some uses, however, that was enough, especially if the blast was big enough. Quadakikl was too experienced to fall for this, and the blast only caused him to be momentarily distracted as he focused on counteracting it. Silverlake, however, wasn't that much of a fighter. The blast caught her entirely by surprise and she reacted too slowly, causing her to get knocked back into the distance. She would be back soon, but it didn't matter. In this kind of battle, every second counted. Silverlake was the weakest among the three enemies facing them, but still very dangerous. Having her gone for a while was great. Sadly, Merva and Daimen had been unable to take advantage of this opportunity because two giant spheres of black bones suddenly burst out of Ayaska Mansion and came barreling down at Merva. As they got closer, they unrolled into familiar skeletal crocodilians. Zorian had seen one of them in action when he and Zack had gone to rob Eldamar's royal treasury with Quadakikl, and knew exactly how powerful and resilient they were. Back then, Quadakikl said the crocodilian skeleton beast was his pet. Of course he actually had more than one. The two skeleton beasts quickly pounced upon Merva, tying him down. "What great allies I have," the ancient lich said, bending his skeletal neck sideways as if he was cracking his neck. His voice was amplified, allowing everyone in the vicinity to hear him. It was probably intended primarily for Jornak and Silverlake, though. Better than nothing, I guess, but only just. You'd think literal time travelers would be better than this. What? Daimen asked, confused. He had been preparing to keep the ancient lich tied down, but Quadakikl's statement made him hesitate. "Oh, he didn't tell you?" Quadakikl said, sounding surprised. "Aren't you his big brother or something? Looks like family doesn't mean what it used to these days." Before Daimen could say anything, two more simulacrums of Quadakikl suddenly appeared right next to the original. Or at least Zorian guessed the lich they had been fighting thus far was the original. All three Quadakikls immediately hasted themselves and turned into a blur. A split second later, each of them cast 3 spells each. 9 red stars, each smaller than the tip of Zorian's finger but shining bright, immediately shot toward Zorian with blinding speed. Daimen scrambled to block them, but it was too little, too late. The first 5 slammed into Damon's golden, multi-layered barrier, blocked by it but ripping it to shreds in the process. The 6th one was stopped by Daimen himself, who retrieved a small mirror from his pocket and physically intercepted the projectile with it. His brother's prized divine artifact lived up to its divine nature and stopped the projectile cold. Unlike the time it stopped Princess's attack beam, it didn't break in the process. There was a flash of light and the red star was just gone, Daimen standing unharmed behind it. The other 3 stars rushed toward Zorian completely unopposed. Up in the sky, his 3 allies realized he was in danger and tried to help him, but Oganj realized what was happening too and suddenly launched an entire swarm of blindingly bright white beams to intercept them and make them unable to render aid. Although aware of the incoming attack due to his simulacrums, Zorian did nothing to evade it. He kept stabilizing the summoning spell with all his might. However, the large metal cube he was resting his hand on wasn't as passive. With a whirring sound of shifting metal plates and internal mechanisms coming to life, it flew in front of him, placing itself in the path of the incoming red stars. 2 of the stars swerved to the side, making sure the cube could only physically intercept one of the stars, but it didn't help. The cube seemingly fell apart at the seams, suddenly separating itself into 8 smaller cubes. They positioned themselves into a rough sphere around Zorian, and a faint blue sphere of magical force, almost invisible, encased the entire area around him. The smaller cubes didn't even try to intercept the red stars after that, and the 3 projectiles slammed into the barrier completely unopposed. The borderline invisible barrier barely even reacted. Anyone standing close to Zorian would see a handful of gentle ripples emanating from the points of impact for a fraction of a second, but these quickly subsided and left no trace of damage on the shield. To his credit, the ancient lich wasn't shocked by the sight. He simply launched into one spell barrage after another, burning through gods know how much mana to launch a multitude of spells at Zorian. Zorian was kind of worried for Daimen at this point, since this kind of onslaught could probably kill his older brother very easily if the lich decided it would be good idea to kill the distraction first. Thankfully, Daimen quickly realized the safest place to be right now was next to Zorian, being protected by his shield, and promptly retreated behind him so that Zorian's cube could protect him as well. And protect them both the cube did. The cube was not a simple spell aid or ward stone like most such tools. It was closer in nature to a golem, and was just as expensive and complicated to build as Merva had been. Although no magic item could truly cast a spell, only maintain one indefinitely, Zorian's cube did a pretty good job of mimicking spellcasting. A dizzying amount of protective spells were constantly maintained by the cube. By amplifying some of them and suppressing others, the cube could adjust its protections from moment to moment, creating custom shields to counter specific type of spells. It did that mostly autonomously, because Zorian had animated it in the same manner in which one would a golem. None of its operation required any mana, or even much attention from Zorian. Thus, none of Quadakikle's attacks were effective. Projectiles slammed into the impenetrable, ever-shifting barrier created by the 8 small cubes orbiting Zorian, producing no effect. Larger, slower attacks were dealt with more actively, by one of the little cubes firing marbles at them. The marbles were all charged with various spell bombs, and each cube had a pocket dimension absolutely packed with them, making it unlikely they would run out of marbles anytime soon. Once the marble detonated next to an attack, it would be either dispersed or weakened enough for the barrier to negate it with ease. Attempts to send ectoplasmic constructs or animated earth at them were dealt with by Daimen, who picked them apart from the safety of the cube's defense. The shield was sufficiently sophisticated that it would let Daimen's attacks pass through without obstruction, even though that was not normally possible when attacking behind another mage's shield. Silverlake and Jornak had recovered by this point and did their best to help Quadakikle, but while Merva was being distracted by the crocodilian skeletons, he wasn't fully tied down. As such, the two had to keep the colossal golem at bay without Quadakikle's help while trying to help him. It wasn't very effective. Eventually Quadakikle realized this wasn't working and that attempting to overpower Zorian in this manner was just him burning through mana for nothing. Zorian wasn't even spending any mana on defending himself, so the Lich's attacks weren't even wearing him out. "Oh Ganj!" Quadakikle suddenly shouted. "Help me crack this turtle's shell. Get these idiots off me, then." Oganj responded, trying to swat away the milky sphere flying around him out of the sky. The ancient Lich crouched and jumped, and immediately shot up into the sky like a bullet. Daimen looked torn between pursuing the Lich, even though he knew this would take him out of the safety of Zorian's shield, and trying to put more pressure on Jornak and Silverlake. He eventually decided to try and kill Jornak. It was probably a smart decision and Zorian fully supported it. While countering whatever Quadakikle was doing would probably be more useful, it would probably result in his death. Zorian would rather face more danger than see Daimen die here. Visions of a pale and bleeding Daimen, near death after he had sacrificed his life force to allow Zorian to save himself, momentarily flooded his mind, his control over the summoning spell slipping. No. Focus. He pushed these thoughts to the side, just like he had pushed them aside this whole month, and focused on the matter at hand. The angel summoning. It had to work, or else the enemy was going to have a whole bunch of demons on their side, and they would have nothing to counter them with. The battle in the air intensified. Somehow Zack and Alanik found a moment to do some spell interruption of their own and directed a barrage of projectiles at Quadakikle's simulacrum standing on the roof of Ayaska Mansion, trying to interrupt his demon summoning. They failed, both because the flying Quadakikle interfered on behalf of his copy and because Ayaska Mansion still had reasonably intact defensive wards, despite all the fighting occurring around it. But then, a disaster struck. Quadakikle managed to distract Zack enough to let Oganj face just Alanik and Svim for a moment. Rather than try to kill one of them, an action that could work, but would probably fail, the Dragon Mage decided to instead try to kill Zorian. Zorian could see the logic of it. Dragon battle magic basically specialized in huge, mana-hungry spells that rivaled human artillery magic in power, but with none of the drawbacks that branch of magic usually had. Quadakikle couldn't overpower Zorian's defenses by sheer number of spells, but a powerful piece of dragon magic could surely crack any kind of shield outside of dedicated building wards like the one centered around Ayaska Mansion. Time seemed to slow down to Zorian as he watched Oganj finish his spell. The dragon's yellow, slitted eyes seemed to radiate pride and contempt as he thrust his scaly, clawed hand towards him, and a huge ball of incandescent flame came screaming down at Zorian. Literally screaming. Zorian didn't know if the old dragon mage added that effect purely for the sake of surprise and intimidation, but the massive fireball created a sharp screaming sound as it flew through the air. Zorian still didn't move to dodge. The 8 little cubes stopped orbiting around him, causing the shield around him to collapse, and flew towards the incoming fireball with great speed, quickly arranging themselves into a ring-shaped formation. Jornak and Silver Lake tried to take advantage of Zorian's momentary defenseless position to kill him before the fireball hit, but Daimen and Merva stopped that from working. As for the fireball, it flew undaunted towards the ring of cubes flying towards it, even though Zorian was sure Oganj could control its flight and try to get it to dodge. He supposed that the dragon mage was confident his spell would overpower whatever defensive effect the cube possessed. He was bound to be disappointed. As the fireball got close to the ring of cubes, it seemed to enter a zone of literal slowed time. A temporal dilation bubble that made time pass slower on the inside than on the outside. Oganj's eyes widened as he tried to pull his spell out of the temporal mire, but the cubes would never allow that. The ring of cubes passed around the burning projectile and it simply disappeared. Then they immediately turned around and re-established the defensive field around Zorian. It was as if the cubes pulled an invisible bag over the fireball and carried it off. Which wasn't that far from the truth, really. Oganj's massive fireball was currently safely stored in the cube's special, time-dilated pocket dimension. It wasn't quite frozen in time, but it was close. Very close. Oganj gave him an angry, hateful look, but was in no position to do anything to him anymore. The moment Quadakikl had given him had passed, and Zack was back in the fight and angrier than ever. Besides, Zorian was almost done with his summoning. Even though he had started his spell later than Quadakikl's simulacrum, he seemed to be working faster. Quadakikl realized it too. You are to manage this alone for a while. I need to speed things up, Quadakikl yelled, and then flew off in the direction of his simulacrum. He soon took a place beside him, causing the demon summoning to speed up immensely. Gritting his teeth, Zorian sent even more mana into the angel cube in his palm, causing it to suck in even more ambient mana from the environment and increasing the strain on his concentration and shaping skills to the edge of the breaking point. Even with the help of his simulacrums, his awareness constantly shrank, until the golden cube above his head became his entire world. Suddenly, the pressure completely disappeared. The air above him warped and twisted, and there was suddenly a huge shadow looming over him. It was the same angel he and Zack had spoken to earlier in the month. Or at least it looked the same to Zorian. A mass of black branches with orange eyes instead of leaves, wreathed in fire and light. However, this incarnation of the angel was bigger. Much, much bigger. The angel in front of him dwarfed virtually everything around it. Even Oganj and Merva looked like children before it. Other than the Solrotham's flying sandworm, this was the largest creature Zorian had laid his eyes on in his life. The angel wasn't alone. Flying around him were what Zorian could only describe as animated balls of white wings. There were at least 20 of them, and if there was a body hidden somewhere beneath all the feathers, Zorian couldn't see it. They looked tiny next to the titanic burning tree of eyes, but Zorian estimated they were twice as big as he was. Another 4 angels, these ones twice as large as the winged things, silently floated next to the main angel. They looked bestial, reminiscent of lions with a very long, flexible body. They flew through the air without wings, their bodies undulating in a serpentine manner, and they had no head. Instead of a head, they had a ring of white masks, each with a different expression, circling above their neck. The sudden appearance of the huge angel and its group put an immediate end to all the aerial fighting. Oganj immediately vacated the area, retreating towards Ayaska Mansion and its defensive wards, while Zack, Alanik, and Svim landed next to Zorian, grateful for a chance to take a breather and replenish their mana reserves. When Zorian looked towards Ayaska Mansion, however, he realized the angels weren't the only new arrivals. Quadikikl had apparently finished his summoning at the same time he did, because there was an army of demons arrayed in front of them. The demons were a diverse bunch. There were hundreds of them huddling around Ayaska Mansion, divided among 30 or so different species. One group looked like man-sized black cats with blood-red eyes and shark-like grins. Another consisted of large, hunched, pale-skinned humanoids with 4 arms, no eyes, a long tail, and quills on their back. Yet another looked like brown eggs scuttling around on long, thin, spider-like legs. A multitude of human faces danced on the surface of the eggs, most of them looking as if in pain. Isolated and given a wide berth even by the other demons, a large dark red rose towered over most of its demon brethren, supported by a multitude of thorny tentacles that probed all around it as if looking for targets. A regiment of humanoid demons stood at attention in one corner, carrying spears and covered from head to toe in black armor with way too many spikes and blade-like protrusions on it, mimicking some ancient human legion. A flock of disgusting, grub-like creatures floated from place to place, dripping saliva everywhere. However, this multitude of demons didn't look too impressive in Zorian's eyes. There were a lot of them, but they were pretty small, at least compared to the angels. Zorian was leery about drawing too many conclusions from the size difference alone, but the way the demon horde subtly cowered every time they looked at the massive burning tree in the sky told Zorian it was not something to completely discount. No, what really worried Zorian was the giant humanoid torso floating above the demon horde. This demon was big. Not as big as the burning tree above Zorian, but big enough to rival Oganj and Merva. The torso was headless and armless, but there was a gigantic eye embedded into its torso, purple and glowing. An armor seemingly made out of various bones, some of them human, some from animals, and some from strange entities that Zorian couldn't recognize, covered the torso, leaving little except the eye visible to the world. The lesser demons beneath it cowered before the group of angels, but the eye in the torso looked completely unafraid, studying the scene before it with detached curiosity. For a moment it glanced at Zorian, and Zorian made the mistake of meeting its gaze. He immediately felt his soul shake and his vision began to blur. A massive black branch extended from the tree above, stabbing into the earth in front of Zorian and breaking the eye contact between him and the purple eye on the horizon. Zorian's mind immediately cleared and he quickly reinforced his soul defenses, directing a silent thanks towards the angel above. He didn't think that would have killed him, but he really didn't want to engage a powerful demon in a soul magic fight, no matter how minor it was. For several seconds, the battlefield was silent, neither side wanting to make the first move. Eventually, Jornak amplified his voice and spoke out to Zorian and the others. "If we fight here, the city will get leveled," he said. "If we don't fight here, you'll release Panicseth and the city will still get leveled," Zack responded, his voice still amplified. "What's your point?" "I'm just foolishly hoping you will see reason," Jornak said. "No matter what you do, the city is doomed. You are doomed. You were doomed the moment you accepted that poisonous contract with the angels. We both know they probably hoped something like this would happen and that you would end up dying at the end of the month, even if you achieve your goal. The primordial is stopped and the hero conveniently disappears at the end of the story, unable to use his godlike abilities to upset the status quo or enact any real change. You were never supposed to survive this." Several seconds ticked by in silence. Zorian glanced at the looming angel above him, trying to see if it would speak up to contradict him. It did not. He had no idea what that meant. Maybe Jornak was right. Maybe the angel thought his words were not even worth responding to. "But I have a chance to live through this. To change things, to change everything for the better," Jornak continued. "Is the sacrifice of one city, a city that spit on your family's sacrifice and robbed you of your birthright, such a heavy sacrifice?" "You're wasting your time," Zack told him. He turned his head skyward, towards the angel above them. "What are you waiting for? Every moment they stall for time, the cultists and their sacrifices get closer to the hole. Let's finish this. Not yet, the angel said simply. Its voice rumbled all around them, deep and resonant. Fine, Jornak said, sounding a bit angry. Zorian didn't understand why did he honestly think Zack would suddenly roll over and die if he asked nicely. They'd even summoned a huge angel and everything. Since you're being like this, let's raise the stakes a little. He snapped his fingers, the sound amplified along with his voice, and 3 different detonations occurred at different spots of the city. Instead of dust and gravel, however, what erupted out of these detonations was a geyser of smoky black shapes. They were difficult to make out from this distance, but Zorian could easily puzzle out what they were. Wraiths. Lots and lots of wraiths. Suddenly, Zorian imitated Jornak's actions and snapped his fingers as well. There was no explosion, but the swarms of wraiths released by the bombs suddenly all converged on several different locations of the city and disappeared. As if a hidden predator had drawn them in and swallowed them without a trace. Jornak seemed confused at the sudden event. Surprised? Zorian said out loud, amplifying his voice. Well, you did give us plenty of forewarning about the wraith bombs. It's only natural that we prepared countermeasures. How? Jornak began, before suddenly stopping when he realized he was asking Zorian to explain how he countered his move. Of course he wasn't going to tell him something like that. In truth, it was something that Zorian had Sudamir to thank for most of all. After all, the man had already figured out how to attract and trap bodiless souls over a wide area inside his mansion. Zorian couldn't really duplicate his grand feat, but he could make smaller versions of the soul well, adapted to trapping wraiths, and scatter them across the city. Even then, trapping free-willed wraiths was significantly different from drawing in ordinary souls of the dead. Zorian had to draw upon his knowledge of the soul-sizer chrysanthemum and its ability to suck in souls of living beings to make the device work well enough. Fortunately, Zorian had gotten lots and lots of insight into the inner workings of the soul-sizer chrysanthemum during the last 6 months of the time loop. Before anyone could say something, everyone noticed a swarm of distant dots approaching the city in the distance. Eagles. Giant eagles ridden by battle mages. Apparently Eldamar's military had managed to organize a response and was about to get involved. Zorian couldn't help but feel a jolt of fear at the thought. This was entirely unplanned, and he had no idea how the soldiers riding on those eagles would react to their presence. The burning tree floating above them, however, didn't seem surprised. Now, we fight, the angel rumbled, before surging towards the demon horde. The demon horde roared out a challenge and rushed forth to meet them. As Zorian watched the massive angel tree and demonic cyclops torso barrel through the air towards one another, his thoughts inevitably took a depressing and fatalistic turn. He wasn't deluded enough to think they could solve this crisis without the city taking massive casualties, but as he watched the impending clash of titans in front of him, he couldn't help but conclude that Jornak was right. The city was going to get leveled to the ground, one way or the other. Thus far, the collateral damage from their battle had been fairly modest. They were fighting around Ayaska Mansion, and a sizable portion of the city around it had gotten replaced with a patch of forest. The trees had taken the brunt of the fighting. There was no way this would remain true for long, and it left Zorian feeling powerless and frustrated. His primary goal was admittedly rather straightforward and selfish. He wanted to ensure he and everyone he cared about survived this evening, but he had lived in this city for a literal decade, and had sunk countless hours and resources into making sure it survived this evening. He did not want to see it destroyed like this. What was their angel ally thinking? It seemed to Zorian that the angel had predicted many of the things that occurred, so why? Almost as if they could hear his silent laments, the remaining angels sprang into action. The 4 lion serpent things that were flanking the burning tree didn't try to join the battle. Instead, they swiftly flew away from the angel tree they had been circling, as if they intended to flee, scattering in all directions. No one was fooled by their maneuver, however, and they soon slowed down and positioned themselves on the edges of the forested area, equidistant from one another. A faint yellow force field immediately enclosed the area in a cubical prison. Though it looked extremely pale and weak, Zorian didn't believe for a moment that it would be easily pierced. Moments later, a barrage of spells from Jornak's side hit the walls of the cube, confirming his suspicions. The barrier was extraordinarily tough. Not even Oganj's spell made it weaken, and the dragon mage could basically fling artillery spells on demand. Zorian relaxed a little, recovering his reserves more as he observed the situation and looked for an opening. Zack and the rest of the people on his side did the same, clustering close to him to take advantage of his powerful defenses. Jornak and Quatakikl launched a few random spells to try to put pressure on them, but those were effortlessly stopped by his defense cube. His precious creation was burning through its stored mana at a terrifying rate to maintain this level of power, but it was also stocked with a terrifying amount of crystallized mana, so it would last for at least another 4 hours. Long enough, in other words. They would either win or lose by then. In any case, neither Jornak or anyone else on the enemy side could devote much time to figuring out a way to get through their defenses. The angel tree and the cyclopean demon collided with terrifying force. A flood of orange flame and lightning-like bursts of purple energy erupted around them, intermingling with one another and sweeping across the entire battlefield, before being stopped by the cubical barrier. For a while, everything was chaos. Those unfortunate enough to be close to the initial clash were either vaporized by the energies, or thrown away much like dandelion fluff picked up by the wind. Everyone else was frantically doing their best to vacate their area, a task made more complicated by the fact the two titans did not stay static, and instead moved around as they fought. All of this was good news for Zorian and his allies. Of course there were only a handful of them, but they were all very powerful, and they had a very good defense that none of them had to spend mana to maintain. Unfortunately, the same thing was largely true for Jornak and his allies, too. They had Iaska Mansion, which had its own wards they could hide behind. Sudamir's work was less advanced than Zorian's, but he had an entire building to work with and literal years to slowly assemble his ward scheme. It would take more than this to break down the mansion's defenses. To Zorian's joy, the stalemate between the two titans didn't last long at all. Although the demon torso never visibly lost its composure and kept fighting fiercely, it soon became obvious it was weaker than the angel tree. It could hold its own against the angel, but it was constantly on the defensive, constantly pushed back and retreating, and utterly unable to stop the angel tree from engaging additional opponents around them. And the angel tree ruthlessly took advantage of it. The angel tree's might was awe-inspiring. Its branches were seemingly numberless and impossibly flexible, stretching to great distances at will and bending like rubber while losing none of their power and destructiveness. Its many eyes allowed it to take in everything around it, and it had incredible multitasking abilities. It was constantly engaging multiple targets simultaneously, slashing undead apart with casual swings of its branches, burning the war trolls to ashes with its eerie orange flames, and snatching the more resilient demons and drawing them deeper into its tangle of limbs where their ectoplasmic bodies would be ripped to pieces by attacks from all directions until they disappeared into puffs of smoke. The 20 angel wing balls that followed the angel tree helped with this task, herding enemies towards the celestial titan with powerful gusts of wind. Even better, every once in a while the angel tree would maneuver the fight to get close to Iaska Mansion and then ruthlessly start pounding on the defensive wards of the building, causing them to visibly strain. The wing balls that followed it contributed to this in their own way, firing intensely bright, lightning-like blasts of energy at the ward scheme. Although the demon torso did everything it could to repulse them from the area, it wasn't doing a good enough job, and eventually Quatakikl and Oganj had to abandon the protection of the mansion in order to help the demon torso suppress the rampaging angels. This was too good of an opportunity to pass up for Zorian and the others, and they decided to join the fray and help the angel tree prevail. After all, they didn't even have to overpower their enemies if they could simply push Oganj or Quatakikl into the angel's waiting embrace. Its lethal branches would take care of the rest for them and they would have one less heavy hitter on the enemy side to worry about. Zorian mentally ordered the defensive barrier of his defense cube to become flatter and more tangible at the bottom, and to spread itself out over a larger area, and the cube automatically rearranged itself according to his wishes. Sigils inscribed on its surface glowed, mechanical pieces whirled and moved into alternative positions, and soon enough Zorian was standing on a large, heavily shielded, flying platform. He signaled to the others to jump on the platform, and when they did, the platform shot towards the scene of the battle with great speed. Sadly, Merva couldn't fit on the platform, so Zorian could only order his beloved creation to follow after them on foot. Not that it mattered much, Merva was all but unstoppable. He had so much weight and speed that just about anything that tried to stop him was simply shoved aside without impeding him much. A regiment of black-armored demons made the most credible attempt, using their great numbers and military-like discipline to slow him down for a time, but even they were ultimately thwarted when Merva jumped into the air to bypass most of them. As they approached, they had a great view of the titanic battle in front of them. With the support of Oganj and Quatakikl, the demon torso had been given a chance at a comeback. It was pouring a stream of dark purple lightning at the angel tree, forcing the celestial being on the defense for the first time in the fight. Jagged rays of red light rampaged through the angel's branches, temporarily unopposed, actually severing some of them and leaving deep gouges on its trunks. As for Oganj, he appeared to be busy fighting off the wing balls that accompanied the angel tree, which were frantically firing their blue lightning blasts at the dragon mage in an attempt to keep at least one opponent away from their leader. Zorian would have ordered the platform to go faster if it wasn't already flying as fast as it possibly could. Then, disaster struck. Some of the lesser demons noticed their advance and decided to stop them. Zorian didn't take them seriously at first, as it was just that flock of disgusting, grub-like creatures that he had noticed floating around the edges of the demon horde when it had first been summoned. He had taken them to be just one more group of minor demons brought in to fill out the numbers, but now that they were attacking him, it quickly became obvious they were one of the more dangerous demon varieties for him personally. That stupid glowing saliva they were drooling all over the place was actually insanely damaging to force shields. The little wretches were capable of spitting globs of it over surprisingly great distances, and they were really quite fast and agile when they tried. And there were a lot of them. As much as he didn't want to, Zorian had to slow down his advance in order to deal with these little pests. Merva was still continuing forward, of course, but the demon horde had a solution for him as well, it seemed. The ground in front of the charging Merva suddenly erupted, and a multitude of thorny, ropey tentacles shot forwards and wrapped themselves around the golem's limbs and torso. Zorian ordered Merva to simply charge through and use his great weight and momentum to break free, but to his surprise, this didn't work. The thorny tentacles refused to break or lose their grip on the golem, and managed to stop its charge. Like an ominous figure, a large rose-shaped demon rose out of the earth, tall enough to tower even over Merva. Zorian remembered seeing it near the epicenter of that initial clash between the angel tree and the demon torso, after which it disappeared. He had thought it died back then, but apparently it simply took shelter under the ground and waited for a convenient moment to reveal itself. Considering it could stop a charging Merva in his tracks, the demon rose was likely quite powerful. They had only spent a few moments engaging the grub swarm and the demon rose when Zorian received a telepathic message from a familiar voice. "What are you doing?" the angel tree thundered in his mind. The voice was calm and collected, but the mental volume of the communication was painfully high and the tone was accusatory. "Stop wasting your time here and get out of this place. You need to stop Panicseth from breaking free of his prison, or else all this will be irrelevant." "What?" Zorian protested, feeling rather wronged at the implication he was willingly wasting time. He glanced at the yellow barrier boxing them in and, sure enough, it was still very much intact. "But the barrier dash. It's for our enemies only," the angel tree said. "It will not stop you." Ugh, and the damn tree only felt like mentioning this now. Why not at the very start of this thing, when it was first erected? This had to be deliberate. The angel had some kind of private plan that involved them staying inside this box for a while, the manipulative bastard. Fine, Zorian told the angel. I just need to get myself and my golem out of this situation and then I'll dash. He hadn't even finished the sentence when the air in front of the platform warped strangely, scaring everyone currently standing on it, and a massive black branch wreathed in orange flames suddenly appeared in front of them, striking down. The grubs harassing them were caught completely off guard by the sudden attack and promptly got speared, bisected, and burned. It was a total wipeout, with the handful of surviving grubs fleeing the scene immediately. The branch continued downward without pause, aiming at the demon rose tangling with Merva. The demon shook and swayed, impossibly agile and flexible, and managed to avoid being speared or cut by the twigs and sub-branches even once, but it could not avoid the flames. The strange orange flames separated themselves from the branch at the last moment, forming into ghostly images of snakes, claws, and jaws, and engulfed the hapless demon rose. It let out an unearthly screech, writhing in pain as it caught on fire, and then retreated underground so fast Zorian thought for a moment it simply disappeared. Apparently the angel tree could casually warp space to strike at opponents way outside its usual range. Just how powerful was this thing? Go, the angel tree urged him, and then immediately severed its contact. There was a roar of triumph, and then the dragon mage was holding a rather thick black branch in one of his claws, its fires sputtering and fading. The angel had paid a high price for this timely assistance, it seemed. Zorian immediately ordered the flying platform they were standing on to change directions and proceed towards the nearest barrier wall at maximum speed. Wait, what are you doing? Zack asked, alarmed. Have you gone crazy? You're going to ram us straight into the barrier wall. It's not going to bar our way, Zorian hurriedly explained. The angel just told me. The angel just told you? Why didn't it tell me? I'm the one they made a contract with, you'd think I would be their contact, Zack grumbled. You're under mind blank, Zorian reminded him. And besides, I'm the one controlling the platform we're flying on. Contacting me is only common sense. The others silently observed their whispered bickering, but said nothing, opting to instead stare at the luminous wall of light they were rapidly hurtling towards. Though Zorian noticed that Svim was watching it with an expression more evocative of awe and appreciation than trepidation. It can even selectively let things through. What a miracle of spellcasting, Svim said in a low voice. Zorian sniffed disdainfully. What was so amazing about that? His defense cube did the exact same thing. But no, he wasn't going to be petty and defensive about this. Not right now, anyway. In any case, there was no time for further conversation, because mere moments later, they collided with the barrier wall. The light parted before them like an airy curtain, caressing their face and skin as it moved out of the way, and then they were out of the box. Everyone except Alanik flinched at the point of impact, unconsciously expecting to get splattered against the magical barrier that had weathered so many titanic impacts from the battle inside. The scarred battle priest's faith and composure was apparently sufficiently strong that he could weather the impact without so much as a twitch. Zorian glanced behind him, only to see no trace of opening where they exited the barrier. The wall of light parted before them in an instant and then closed together just as quickly. It was also not nearly as transparent from the outside as it was from the inside. It was instead completely opaque, effectively shrouding the shielded area from curious outsiders trying to peer in. Zorian was ecstatic, but also a little worried. With them outside of the angel barrier and their enemies trapped inside, Zack and Zorian could crush the cultists trying to conduct the Panicseth releasing ritual inside the hole and essentially win by default. On the other hand, Zorian's secret plan hinged on him hitting everyone all at once with his spell, something that was impossible while Jornak and the others were holed up in Ayaska Mansion, and protected by the angel barrier. He would have to get them out of there eventually before he could initiate the plan, and that worried him a little. Of course, he voiced none of these thoughts. He silently directed their flying platform towards the hole and prepared himself for another fight. The others didn't need any explanation to understand what he was planning. Stopping the cultists was the obvious goal. There was, however, another problem approaching. While they had been distracted by fighting inside the angel barrier, Eldamar's giant eagles had been approaching the city as fast as they could. Now, they were just about to arrive and Zorian could see they were aiming straight at Zorian and his flying platform. He supposed that the glowing cubical barrier the angels erected was very eye-catching, and the fact they had just flown out of it made them obvious targets. Zorian had no idea what the eagle mages would do. He had assumed they would recognize the angels, but the angels were busy inside the barrier and couldn't vouch for them. Which meant they would probably do whatever came naturally to them in a situation like this. That was not encouraging. From the perspective of Eldamar's authorities, it all probably looked like a bunch of rogue mages fighting in the city and wrecking stuff in the process. They may very well decide to just bring the hammer down on everyone and sort things out later. Zorian had heard that was a common reaction to whenever mage disputes escalate into open battles inside a populated settlement. One side may have been entirely in the right, but Eldamar's forces only see two troublemakers endangering innocent civilians and treat everyone as an enemy. Zorian could only hope that the sheer scope of the fighting would give the Eagle Riders pause and make them a little more cautious and discerning. The sheer amount of firepower both sides used against each other should hopefully convince the royal forces they need to take a side instead of behaving like the biggest bully. Unfortunately, Zorian's hopes were in vain. With incredible speed, the Eagle Riders caught up to them and swooped in front of them, the giant eagles releasing ear-piercing screeches. It was a clear warning that they would attack if the platform did not stop. "Halt, in the name of the Kingdom of Eldamar," the lead mage said in a voice amplified and distorted by magic. "Power down your flying platform and land on the ground, now. This is your only warning." Zorian clacked his tongue in annoyance. He stopped the platform, but did not move to land. This was such an annoying issue. Although Zorian was sure all of them put together were more than enough to take out the Eagle Riders, it would take an unacceptable amount of time and mana. More importantly, Zorian wasn't sure his allies would even agree to attack Eldamar's forces who technically did nothing wrong. Zack doubtlessly would, but Zorian was all but certain that Alanik would refuse to help them, and he wasn't confident about Svim and Daimen either. If only the makeshift flying platform was faster than the Eagles, but his defense cube was ultimately designed for defense and not flight speed, and giant eagles were famously fast flyers. "Captain," Zorian said, his voice similarly amplified and distorted, "look around the city. It's under attack and we're helping. We'll gladly explain things later, but..." It wasn't a request, the man interrupted him impatiently. "I order you to land and explain yourselves or we will attack you immediately." The Eagle Riders circled around them threateningly, giving the appearance of a pack of wolves just waiting for a sign to attack. Two things happened simultaneously, then. First, there was a commotion back at the angel barrier. Glancing in its direction, Zorian could see Oganj repeatedly impacting the barrier of light, front claws glowing with red light. Each time he slashed at the barrier he created large gashes in the wall that healed almost instantly. Secondly, Zorian realized the Eagle Riders didn't have any serious mental defenses on them. They only had a basic mental shield that couldn't even provide a speed bump against his psychic powers. As for the Eagles, they were even worse. Completely defenseless. "This is your last," started the Eagle Mage commander, but was interrupted by a draconic roar. Oganj had finally managed to tear a hole in the barrier large enough to squeeze himself through and immediately tore himself out of the containment barrier the angels erected around Ayaska Mansion. The barrier quickly mended itself, but it was too late. The dragon mage was out of the box. And riding on his back were Quatakikl, Silver Lake, and Jornak. Well. So much for his worries about having to eventually lure their enemies out of the barrier. In any case, the Eagle Riders were clearly surprised at the appearance of an adult dragon so close to them, and unsure what to do for a moment. In that moment, Zorian struck. He reached out into the minds of the giant eagles, every single one of them, and ordered them to attack Ogange while amplifying their anger until they were completely berserk. They let out frenzied screeches and made a beeline for the approaching dragon mage, ignoring their rider's panicked attempts to regain control. He then reached towards the mind of the Eagle Rider commander, and forced him to make a loud proclamation in that amplified voice of his. The man had no choice but to obey. Ogange! It's the dragon mage, the man shouted against his will. Forget those small fries, we need to take him down. Kill the dragon, another Eagle Rider agreed, also forced to do so by Zorian. Ogange reacted exactly as Zorian hoped he would. The dragon mage was proud and aggressive, and had clashed against Eldamar's forces numerous times in the past. He saw nothing suspicious about a bunch of Eldamar mages making him their priority target, and he had every intention of teaching them a lesson. He gave a roar of challenge and shifted his focus to killing the Eagle Riders, ignoring Jornak's loud complaints that he shouldn't get distracted. Zorian quietly withdrew his telepathic influence from the minds of the Eagle Riders and ordered his platform to continue flying towards the hole at maximum speed. Even if they wanted to continue bothering him, they had a more pressing problem on their hands now. After a few seconds, he noticed that everyone except Zack was staring at him strangely. "What?" he asked, frowning. "You did that, didn't you?" Alanik asked. "Oh yeah, definitely," Zorian said, only understanding after a few seconds why they reacted that way to his casual display of mind control. Sometimes he forgot that these weren't the same people he had worked with for over a year to figure out how to leave the time loop. Those people had died forever, even their souls erased and denied afterlife. "Are they going to be alright?" Alanik asked, frowning. He clearly didn't like the idea that Zorian might have sent the Eagle Riders to fight and die against their enemies with no support. Funnily enough, it didn't even occur to Zorian to care for their well-being. He thought of them as an annoyance, and saw his actions as a form of poetic justice for impeding their mission and trying to push them around. They came looking for trouble, and they found it. His original self, whom Zorian killed in order to be able to stand here today, would definitely be horrified at what he had become. "They won't all die," Zorian eventually answered. "I fought with them a few times over the various iterations of this month. They eventually retreat if the enemy inflicts enough losses on them. They came here to fight for Eldamar," Zack helpfully added. "They're doing exactly that right now. If they knew what we know, they would have chosen to engage Ogange anyway, even if most of them died doing that. Explaining my involvement in this is going to be hell, I can already see," Alanik lamented. "We did take basic precautions," Zack said. "We're all wearing disguises, and the battle will destroy most of the clues and prevent normal divinations from working. Plus, we have a mastermind mage that can delete memories of people who get too close to the truth. It doesn't matter in my case," Alanik said. "Do you know how hard it was to mobilize all these people I recruited to fight on our side? I had to use my name and connections to make all this happen. There is no hiding this, even if you start mind-wiping people." Well, if Zack was going to survive this evening, Zorian was definitely going to have to start mind-wiping people, and sooner than anyone in this group suspected. Thankfully, nobody was in the mood to continue this topic, both because they were now very close to the hole, and because they were facing yet another threat. Jornak, Silverlake, and Quatakikl were rapidly approaching, using some kind of high-speed flight spell in an effort to catch up to them. They knew that everything was over if Zorian and the rest of the group could face off against the cultists alone, and they weren't going to let it happen. Before Zorian and the others could really start disrupting the ritual, the battle against Jornak, Silverlake, and Quatakikl began anew. While his original body had been busy dealing with angels, demons, and eagle riders, his simulacrum bodies had not been idle. They roamed the city and processed information that Zorian constantly received from the multitude of remote sensors and recruited subordinates working with the group to repel the invasion. The primary, albeit secret, task they had was to make sure the network of glyphs he had scattered all across Scioria remained reasonably intact. The unplanned substitution of an entire city section with Ayaska Mansion and the surrounding forest had already blown a sizable hole in his network, so he had to be extra vigilant, or parts of his remaining network would become disconnected from the network as a whole, making his entire plan useless. While doing that, however, his simulacrums also involved themselves in the fighting here and there. These interventions were by necessity minor, since he couldn't afford to waste too much of his mana in peripheral areas of the city. The original body had a much more critical role to play, so the majority of their mana reserves were reserved for his use. Fortunately, he had a perfect tool for the situation. His mind magic, if used thoughtfully and strategically, was perfect for making large impacts in return for minimal mana expenditures. All around the city, strange incidents began to occur. Many of them were so subtle they could be chalked up as coincidences. A panicked group of scattered defenders suddenly surged with newfound confidence and remembered where they were all supposed to converge and regroup in event of emergency. A fleeing family received a strong hunch that the route they wanted to traverse wasn't safe and that they should pick another way. A large, muscular man wielding an antique sword, clearly just a normal city worker without a hint of magic or military training, fended off an entire pack of winter wolves all on his lonesome, allowing a nearby military group to save both him and the people he was protecting. For some reason the winter wolves kept missing him, as if they couldn't see him correctly. A local dog suddenly went berserk and began barking and biting at thin air, alerting a nearby mage to the presence of an invisible Abasan battle group waiting in ambush. Others were less mundane. All around the city, some people received sudden, supernatural visions that gave them critical information about the enemy. Enemies sometimes went crazy and started attacking their own allies for no reason, sowing chaos and discord in enemy ranks. Small animals like bats and bugs were inordinately fond of ramming themselves straight into enemy casters' faces when they were in the middle of sensitive spellcasting. A young soldier suddenly fell into an obvious trance and started describing the enemy distribution of forces to his commander, hopefully allowing much better coordination of defending efforts in that city sector. Meanwhile, up in the sky, iron beaks ceaselessly patrolled the city in both large and small groups. They were Zorian's roving eyes and blades, the small groups checking out disturbances to see if anything interesting was happening, and the big ones converging on critical areas to give aerial support to whatever defenders were located in the area. Each flock carried one or more telepathic relays, allowing Zorian to both easily access their senses and occasionally take control of them to direct them to specific spots. They were smart birds, with already existing group discipline, so he only had to take control over the leaders in order to control the whole group, which was good, because there was no way he would have been able to control the iron beaks otherwise. Convenient. No wonder Sudamir had decided to use these particular birds for the invasion. The iron beaks were bloodthirsty and their feather volleys were extremely deadly. They were fast and agile flyers too, which allowed the flocks to simply swoop in and let loose a feather volley at the surprised enemies, before simply flying away to engage someone else. With Zorian managing their attacks, their strikes were far more strategic and selective than the iron beaks themselves would have ever been on their own. They now almost exclusively targeted mages, instead of wasting their feathers on tough targets like war trolls and other dominated monsters, usually striking when the target was exhausted or busy dealing with something else. Despite all of this, the scale of the invasion was vast, and Jornak had brought a large number of fresh troops into the city when he had brought Ayaska Mansion into the city. Zorian's actions were just a drop in the bucket, and it was hard to judge how much difference his actions made in the grand scheme of things. A lot of times he could do nothing but watch as the invaders killed and torched their way through the city. He could do a lot with relatively little when he spotted an opening, but not every situation had one. Or at least, not one that he could spot. Maybe someone smarter than him could have seen some obvious solution that he had missed, but he was still only human, and a lot of the time he saw no way to help without burning through his mana at an unacceptable rate. So instead, he did nothing. He watched people fight and die over and over, across the entire city, withholding his help because it would cost too much. He wanted to say the experience made him sick, but the truth was that he was already somewhat numb to it. He had seen things like this happen many times over the restarts, and had even experienced some of these things from the invader's perspective due to his memory reading. Maybe later, when the situation was over and he had time to internalize that all of this was final and irreversible and not at all like the time loop, he would be horrified by the things he had seen and his own lack of reaction to it, but now wasn't the time for it. It just wasn't the time. He eventually turned his attention to the hole, where a fierce fight was happening. While Zorian and Jornak's groups were trapped underneath the angel barrier, the cultists had been free to proceed towards the hole for a time. There was an element that neither Zorian nor Jornak had expected. Before the cultists could even begin setting up the ritual and start sacrificing the children, they were ambushed by a large number of small animals. Pigeons and cats, to be more precise. Instead of simply clawing or pecking at the cultists, however, these cats and pigeons employed magic spells and weapons. As the cultists were escorting their wagon of sacrificial children near one of the bigger buildings, a handful of cats simply dropped from the roof and onto their heads. Their claws glowing white from the effects of some unknown spell, they swung towards their targets' necks and faces, slicing open arteries and permanently blinding others. One of the cultists noticed the incoming attack, but he made the mistake of meeting the eyes of a cat sitting on a nearby windowsill and was suddenly hit by a powerful bout of vertigo that sent him reeling. He never had a chance to recover, as another cat ripped his throat out a mere moment later. Before the cultists could respond to this attack, a flock of pigeons swooped in, carrying a multitude of alchemical grenades in their claws, and all hell broke loose. Shifters, Zorian quickly realized. Cat and pigeon shifters, the two varieties that were probably most proficient in classical spellcasting in addition to their natural shifting capabilities. And yes, there was the police force joining the attack now. Apparently Rainey and Hazlush had done more in this past month than Zorian thought they would. A surprise, but a welcome one. Of course, while the cultists often seemed like the weakest part of the invasion from Zorian's perspective, they were really not so easy to dismiss for regular people. After the initial shock, the cultists began to fight back, and they did so extremely well. After all, the leaders of the cult of the World Dragon were actually very powerful and capable mages. Usually they were too busy enacting Panicseth's ritual to help their underlings, but at the moment this wasn't the case, so they quickly made their presence known. After some initial successes, the combined shifter police forces began to die in droves and lose their courage. There was no way Zorian could allow this, though, so he instructed his iron beaks to help out and started subtly and not so subtly directing city defenders to rush over towards the hole and join the battle. Interestingly, the pigeon shifters adapted really well to the iron beaks' assistance. Many of them appeared to be capable of casting certain spells purely reflexively, which meant that any of the seemingly innocuous pigeons could drop a fireball on an enemy group or summon a force barrier to defend both themselves and the iron beaks from enemy spells. Even though Zorian didn't attempt to communicate with any of them, the pigeon shifters soon naturally fell into the role of support, following iron beak flocks and shielding them against enemy fire so they could operate relatively unmolested in the sky. As for the cat shifters, their animal forms were mostly useful for surprise purposes and not terribly impressive for these kind of battles, so Zorian feared they would be useless after that initial ambush, but he was wrong. The cat shifters simply switched back into their human forms and started contributing by casting spells normally. Amusingly, they were kind of similar to Zorian, in that their biggest talent seemed to lay in mind magic. Zorian supposed that, since so many of them already operated on the criminal side of things, they were less hesitant to practice mind magic than a regular mage. Then Merva barged into the scene, tanking enemy spell fire like it was inconsequential and crashing into the cultist ranks like a cannonball. The original may have been too busy elsewhere and couldn't come, but there was no stopping Merva. His presence slowly but surely started to turn the tide in the favor of Sciorian forces. The leaders of the cult were powerful, but so was Merva. Idly, Zorian wondered if it wouldn't have been better for the original and his allies to simply teleport to the hole the moment they escaped the angel barrier, and then kill the cultists as quickly as possible, but considering that the cultists still hadn't even begun the ritual as of yet, maybe it was for the best that they hadn't done that. Who knows how Jornak would have reacted if he knew for certain that releasing Panicseth was impossible and that he was going to die soon. Although it may have seemed like Zorian had neatly eliminated the threat of wraith bombs with his counter traps, the truth was he only had enough time and funds to make those for Cyoria. There were wraith bombs scattered all over Eldamar and possibly beyond, and Zorian could only thank the gods that Jornak didn't see fit to activate them as well out of sheer spite. And that was just the wraith bombs. Although Zorian was sure that some of Jornak's threats were pure bluffs, he had no doubt that the man had plenty of contingencies that would make them all suffer if he lost. Even Zack and Zorian had made a few contingencies that would go off if they didn't survive this battle, so there was no way Jornak hadn't done the same. It still wasn't the right time. All Zorian could do was wait and look for an opening. Zorian stared at the three creatures in front of him. One was some kind of tiger-sized reptilian creature that Zorian did not recognize, another was a floating orb surrounded by long whip-like tentacles, and the third one was a gigantic green ooze the size of a small building. His defense cube spun around him, sigils on it brightening and fading like the beat of his own heart and mechanical parts softly shifting into various combinations. For a second, everything was still, before both sprang into motion and the battle began anew. The tentacle orb was the first, being the fastest. It hurled itself at Zorian with incredible speed, its milky white body crackling with powerful electrical magic. Zorian didn't panic, simply jumping to the side while telekinetically enhancing his jump a little. He easily dodged out of the way of the living cannonball, and another sidestep dodged the electrified whip the creature tried to hit him with next. The other two creatures weren't that far behind, though. The blue tiger lizard thing used the distraction created by the whip orb to charge at him, preparing for a jump. Zorian flicked a spell marble at the thing, creating a large detonation right in its face and blowing it back with ease. The creature slammed into the already damaged road and promptly burst into liquid. A mere moment later, the blue puddle of slime started to come together again, and a few seconds later the tiger lizard thing was intact and once again gunning for him. As for Zorian himself, he was too busy trying to avoid being engulfed by the house-sized blob of acid to worry about finishing the tiger lizard thing off for good. The giant ooze was completely unlike most oozes, and moved with speed and dexterity that no natural ooze should possess, let alone one that size. It constantly sprouted pseudopods that lashed out at Zorian, leaving corroded cobblestones whenever it hit, and its great weight and power allowed it to simply smash apart buildings if they were in its way or it thought the rubble might inconvenience Zorian. All three were working seamlessly together with one another, and showed both signs of human-level intelligence and detailed knowledge of human spellcasting. Though one might mistake them for some kind of exotic magical creature at first, Zorian knew he wasn't looking at a natural creation. If Zorian had to guess, he would say these beings were something akin to living potions, an alchemical liquid animated by either captured souls or elemental spirits. Possibly both a multitude of captured souls for providing abundant mana, and water elementals for actually controlling the liquid. A grating, cackling laugh rose into the air behind the giant ooze. Silverlake seemed to be mighty pleased at how her minions were faring against Zorian. "You shouldn't have sent your metal toy away," she crowed. "Maybe you'd actually have a chance against me and my lovelies if you had this Merva at your side." Zorian said nothing, simply scanning his surroundings for a way he could bypass the potion elementals and strike at Silverlake. It didn't look like he did, but that was because he was primarily looking through the eyes of a small flock of iron beaks, circling the skies above the battlefield rather than trying to use divinations in the middle of a battle. The whip orb tried to rush at him again, but Zorian fired a thin line of force at it that speared it right through. It immediately burst into a cloud of electrified potion droplets, causing Zorian to wince. This wasn't a good way to hold the orb at bay, it seemed. "This is so frustrating," Zorian lamented in his head. "I spent a decade inside a time loop. You'd think I would have encountered every type of enemy there is. I hope you realize we found out where you stashed your little sister and her cat shifter friend to keep them safe. Our forces are attacking them even as we speak, Silverlake said, punctuating her threat with her usual annoying cackle. Zorian narrowed his eyes at her, but did not let her distract him. This was a blatant attempt to demoralize him, and he wouldn't fall for it. Not that he thought she was lying. He had known for a while now that Kiriel and Nachka were being besieged in their hideouts, but there was little he could do. He could only hope that the Terramachula guards and mercenaries Daimen hired would be able to protect them, or that the miniature bodyguard golems he made for them would step up if they couldn't. I hope you realize the cult of the World Dragon hasn't even begun their ritual, Zorian fired back. He knew he shouldn't talk in the middle of the battle, but her mentioning the attack on Kiriel and how he was essentially forced to ignore it struck a nerve and he couldn't help it. Look around us. You clearly can't deal with me and neither can your allies deal with my allies. You won't win anything by keeping us busy. As if by some cosmic joke, his statement was punctuated by a loud detonation as an ominous purple sun exploded in the sky nearby, casting the entire city in a deep purple glow for a moment. An aftershock of Quadakikle's battle against Daimen, Svim, and Alanik. Jornak and Zak were also having their own fight nearby, though Zorian could not see it. Jornak had used some kind of strange ability granted to him by Panicseth to shroud an entire section of the city in thick white mist that no spell could penetrate into. Offensive spells simply sank into the mist and disappeared without a trace, and divination spells went awry when directed at the area. Zorian wasn't terribly worried about Zak, though. Zak had shown himself to be noticeably stronger than Jornak in their past clashes, so he doubted this move was enough to tip the scales. More likely than not, this was just Jornak stalling until Quadakikle and Oganj could finish off their opponents so they can gang up on them 3-on-1. You are such a fool, Zorian, Silverlake said. A bunch of fire spells on parabolic trajectories came flying over the giant ooze and straight at Zorian, but he dispelled them with ease. We could have both profited off this if you had agreed to work with me. We could have opened a small crack in Panicseth's prison and then immediately mended it. My oath to the primordial would have been technically fulfilled, and the city would be left standing. Hell, we could have sabotaged the whole invasion from within. Imagine how many lives that would save. Instead you insist on staying with a dead man compromised beyond all belief. Are you gay? Is this what's going on? There is no way to fix Panicseth's prison once it cracks, Zorian told her, not rising to her bait. He telekinetically seized a large piece of a nearby ruined wall and hurled it at the giant ooze. It failed to punch through and instead got stuck inside the green slime that made up its body. You're just comforting yourself with nonsense. You took Panicseth's offer because you thought it was a sure thing, as opposed to our own escape plan, which would have required you to trust another human being for once in your life. Now that this sure thing is screwing you over, you're grasping at straws. It's still a sure thing. You think we need those shifter children for the ritual? Silverlake cackled. Have you forgotten these bodies me and Red Robe have are made by Panicseth? Both of us contain enough of Panicseth's essence to form a link to him and crack this prison open. We kept the child sacrifice just to distract you. Zorian scowled. That made a disturbing amount of sense. The shifter children collectively had only a tiny amount of primordial essence in them, so a mass sacrifice was needed to get enough material to form a key, but Jornak and Silverlake were specifically incarnated into the real world by Panicseth to help his release. He probably had no shortage of his own essence and it was of no use to him in his prison. Any response he might have given was postponed as a veritable rain of alchemical bombs rained down from the sky around him, forcing him to dodge and shield himself from their effects. Worse, some of the alchemical mixtures reformed themselves into tiny liquid animals soon after detonation and started attacking him. Smaller versions of the three creatures he was already dealing with, obviously. So annoying. You're the one controlling the birds above us, right? Silverlake continued. You can see through their eyes, so I'm sure you can tell how Oganj's battle is progressing. Zorian glanced at the battle in question and sighed internally. The performance of Eldamar's eagle mages was praiseworthy. Any compulsion Zorian might have placed on them had long since worn off, but they kept fighting Ogange regardless and they held their own admirably. But Ogange was still a dragon mage, and one famous even among his own kind. Even as Zorian watched, Ogange pointed his claw at one of the eagle riders and an expanding ball of razor-sharp threads exploded around him. If this was the start of the battle, the eagle rider in question would have evaded or shielded himself against the attack, but by now he was too exhausted and wounded to resist effectively. The tangled mass of severing threads instantly turned both him and his giant eagle into a bloody mess. Blood and chunks of flesh began to slowly fall to the ground. The eagle riders weren't going to last much longer, and when they decided to cut their losses and flee, Ogange was going to come here to turn the tides of battle. He glanced further into the distance, where the angel cube was located, but the cube was opaque from the outside and he couldn't see anything. He had no idea what was happening inside. "What's your point?" Zorian asked, a spark of light entering his eyes as he finally spotted an opportunity. "You aren't still trying to turn me to your side, are you?" "Heavens, no," Silverlake said. "Tell you what, though, if you give me the Imperial Orb, I'll let you flee the city and pretend I couldn't stop you." The old witch really had a talent for getting under people's skin, Zorian had to give her that. He made his move. The whip orb and the tiger lizard had just tried to attack him together and landed very close to each other. He exploited this ruthlessly by casting a rather obscure spell on the section of the road they were standing on, ripping it straight out of the ground and catapulting it straight into the sky and away from his current position. Before Silverlake could react to this, he mentally activated the explosives he snuck into the chunk of the ruined wall he had flung at the giant ooze. The wall section, still floating inside the ooze, blew up in a spectacular explosion that burst the gigantic potion elemental like an overripe melon. It didn't actually kill it, but it didn't have to. It was temporarily incapacitated until it could reform, and that was all that mattered. The path was open. He teleported in front of the surprised Silverlake. She had hurriedly shielded herself to protect herself from the chunks of her own potion elemental flying everywhere, and was currently ill-suited to protect herself. The moment Zorian blinked into existence in front of her, she sneered at him with an expression of smug triumph, and he detected the trap ward she placed on the area activating. She knew he was coming. Zorian's mind went into overdrive. Time seemed to slow down. Elsewhere, his simulacrums stopped what they were doing as the information about the ward was dissected and analyzed by multiple minds bouncing ideas and theories between each other. Before the ward had time to fully activate, Zorian had figured out what it did and where its flaws were. Wordlessly, he stomped his foot and sent streams of non-structured magic all around him, poking and disrupting the rapidly forming structure of the ward. Simultaneously, he fired off a simple magic missile spell at a seemingly innocuous glyph faintly carved into the nearby cobblestones, destroying it utterly. The entire ward suddenly imploded upon itself, carved sigils burning out in a flash of blue light. Silverlake stumbled back, her mind hit by the backlash of the ward control function suddenly sending a bunch of gibberish at her. Before she could recover, Zorian was already casting spell after spell at her. Force projectiles powerful enough to turn stone to powder, fire spells hot enough to melt steel, potent disintegration beams. The attack kept coming and coming, giving Silverlake no chance to take a breath and center herself. She tried to activate some kind of recall object to teleport away, but Zorian blocked it from working. Finally, her inexperience with these kinds of battles began to show, and her shields broke. A force projectile hit her straight in the head, and half of her face instantly became a blood mist. Instead of stopping, Zorian blew up the rest of her head as well, and blew a bunch of holes in her torso for good measure as well. For a second, the scene was quiet. But something was wrong. Her headless, mutilated body staggered back but didn't fall. Instead, flesh grew out of her wounds at a terrifying rate, quickly, reforming her head and healing the rest of her wounds. Zorian couldn't help but be disturbed. Even if she had drunk a portion of troll regeneration or something, a destroyed head was still a killing strike. He tried to incinerate her just in case, engulfing her rapidly regenerating form in an intense cone of flame. Unfortunately, by now the giant ooze had managed to reform itself and launched another attack at Zorian, forcing him to break off the attack before he could fully reduce her to ash. The moment he stopped, the charred, skeletal corpse of Silver Lake again started to regenerate at a terrifying rate, regrowing muscles and skin at a speed that even trolls and hydras would find amazing. Especially considering the damage was inflicted by fire. The half-healed body of Silver Lake started to shake and gurgle, before breaking into painful coughing and spewing out blood everywhere. After a few seconds, Zorian realized this was Silver Lake trying to cackle. "See? You can't kill me," Silver Lake said, almost completely recovered now. "It was a sure thing, and you are the fool here. This was so very worth it." "No one is unkillable," Zorian said, launching a few more attack spells at her. She started defending herself again, though, so none of them actually landed on her this time. She wouldn't be defending herself if being hurt was inconsequential. She had a limit, somewhere. "I bet if I keep hurting you, you will eventually die for good." Eventually, she agreed, firing some spells back at him half-heartedly. The giant ooze tried to interpose itself between him and Silver Lake again, but Zorian refused to let her out of his line of fire again. "But I bet it will take longer to exhaust my regeneration than it will to exhaust your mana reserves. Even with that cube acting as free defense, you still have to burn through your reserves to hurt me. And besides, Ogange will soon dash." A sound reminiscent of a ceramic plate breaking into pieces resonated somewhere in the distance. The angel cube, long silent, shattered and faded away, revealing the result of the angel-demon battle. The angel tree was triumphant. Neither the massive demon torso nor its accompanying demon horde could be seen anywhere. The angel had paid a heavy price for its victory. One of its main trunks was merely a stump now, and two of the others had the majority of its branches ripped and sliced off. Many of its eyes were missing, and the strange orange fires were no longer covering the whole tree, but were instead thin and faded. All but three of its accompanying wing balls were gone, and one of the surviving wing balls was clearly missing a lot of its wings and zigzagging across the sky as if drunk. Of the sinuous lion serpent things that created the barrier, there was no trace. Maybe they used up all of their power to maintain that thing. Regardless, the angel tree did not rest or waste time. It shook itself slightly, flexing its branches like a fighter warming himself up before the fight, and then immediately accelerated like a cannonball toward Ogange. The dragon mage let loose a roar of frustration at all these distractions, but made no attempt to flee. He clearly had every intention of fighting the wounded angel. Although she did not have flocks of iron beaks acting as her eyes all over the city, Silver Lake must have seen the event in some way, because she immediately scowled in response. "Don't think you dash," she began. But Zorian wasn't listening. Now that he knew Ogange was taken care of, there was no reason to keep this in reserve anymore. He reached into his pocket and threw a palm-sized metal ball on the ground in front of himself and Silver Lake. He then immediately withdrew to a safe distance. The contents of the pocket dimension prison inside that ball were less a controlled weapon, and more a bloodthirsty maniac you pointed at the enemy and hoped for the best. Silver Lake's eyes widened in fear and shock when the Grey Hunter materialized in front of her, and all confidence seemed to drain out of her posture. She started screaming a long string of curses as she desperately fought to keep the killer spider away from her. Zorian kept himself well back from the two combatants, somewhat unsure if he wanted to involve himself. Although he had managed to capture the Grey Hunter and stuff it into a pocket dimension, he did not actually control it by any measure. It was a feral magical beast released off its chain, and if he wasn't careful, it could easily shift its attention to him instead. Thus, he mostly stayed on the sidelines and watched the battle. Eventually, though, Silver Lake started to use the giant ooze she had at her disposal to take control of the Grey Hunter's movements, and Zorian decided he had to intervene. As amazing as the gray spider was, the giant ooze was huge and could keep the spider away from Silver Lake through sheer mass alone. He never got the chance to involve himself, though. Before he made his move, the giant ooze suddenly froze, shuddered slightly, and then collapsed into an inert puddle of acidic slime. Well, more like a small lake, but still. It was dead. What? Who are you? How do you know how to do this? Silver Lake said, looking left and right for the perpetrator while running from the Grey Hunter, who now had an open path forwards and wasted no time in going after her again. The other person did not answer at first. Instead, a crude but effective warding circle suddenly sprang up around the area where Silver Lake and the Grey Hunter were fighting, trapping her with the murder spider. Zorian suddenly realized what was happening. He could recognize this ward easily enough, and there was only one person he ever saw using it. He had to say, he didn't expect this. Soon, Zorian's unlikely ally stepped out from the shadow of a nearby building, dropping her stealth spell in the process. It was Silver Lake. Old Silver Lake. The same annoying witch that Zorian remembered from the time loop, her body slightly hunched and ravaged by old age and her face was covered in wrinkles. You! What the hell do you think you're doing? Young Silver Lake yelled, outraged. The old Silver Lake did not answer her. She slowly began to walk around the warding circle in which she trapped her copy, tapping the borders with her staff and methodically reinforcing the ward so it was harder to break. Her expression was grave and serious. There was no cackling this time, no stupid jokes or attempt to throw her opponent out of balance with words. It was actually kind of eerie to see Silver Lake behaving like this. Don't you know who I am? Young Silver Lake protested. I'm you. I'm you from the future. I know that Brad over there already told you this, so why dash? If you're really my copy, then you know what happened the last time we made a copy of ourselves, and let it do as it pleased, old Silver Lake said calmly, not stopping her work or even glancing at her younger self. The young Silver Lake seemed to be momentarily at a loss for words and remained silent. Exactly, old Silver Lake concluded. It's only a matter of time before you come for me. My home, my connections, my life, you want it all, and you clearly outstrip me in power. This is my best opportunity to remove you as a threat. I must take it. Probably, old Silver Lake said, shrugging her shoulders. Zorian took one more look at the situation, thought about it for a moment, and then decided to let the two Silver Lakes deal with each other and move on to other targets. He could see that Jornak's mist was starting to thin out and evaporate, which probably meant his battle with Zack was close to ending. It was time. He jumped into the air, his defense cube dutifully following after him, and used a fast-flying spell to quickly reach the hole. The cultists were still holding their own against the combined forces assaulting them, but they were exhausted and unprepared for Zorian's arrival. He immediately started scything them down, butchering the whole group of them with a severing whip while trusting his cube to protect him from retaliation. Simultaneously, he took closer control over Merva again, and the golem's attacks suddenly became a lot more accurate and strategic. After only a handful of seconds, most of the cultists realized they stood absolutely no chance against Zorian and his golem, and their discipline fell apart. They started to panic and run, ignoring the threats their leader spouted at them. As Zorian suspected, his actions provoked an immediate reaction. In the distance, Ogan shouted a bunch of expletives and then separated himself from the angel he was fighting in order to rush towards the hole. He received a deep gash in his flank for turning his back to his opponent like that, but he bore it with barely a grimace. Then, not far from where Zorian was cutting down the hapless cultists, a huge blast of magical force leveled an entire section of the city and a pitch-black skeleton suddenly flew out of it, flying at Zorian at maximum speed. Zorian quickly scanned the area quadakikal left and breathed a sigh of relief. Svim, Alanik, and Daimen were in extremely poor shape, but they were still alive. Svim was unconscious and Daimen was severely wounded and bleeding, but Alanik was quick to administer aid so they should both survive. They should. But no, he couldn't get distracted. Oganj and Quadakikl were both coming here, but the Lich was closer and would be here sooner. Although he was just a mindless golem, he couldn't help but glance at Merva looming above him a little sadly. It was nice knowing you, Merva. Being a mindless construct, Merva did not answer him. He simply turned towards the rapidly approaching Quadakikl and spread his giant arms as if offering the incoming Lich a hug. To his credit, Quadakikl immediately understood that something was wrong and tried to swerve out of the way. It didn't help him. There was no dodging this. Merva's chest opened up like a metal flower, exposing a complicated magical device with a glass tank acting as a centerpiece. Trapped within the glass tank was a large soul-sizer chrysanthemum, which immediately woke up from its stupor and focused on the only target his current prison allowed him to perceive: Quadakikl. Normally, the flower wouldn't have been powerful enough to threaten the ancient Lich, especially from this distance, but its current housing wasn't just a prison. It was an amplifier and a focus device, vastly increasing the flower's range and power. Without reservations, Merva immediately started burning through his entire internal supplies of mana, amplifying the flower's attack more and more. It still wasn't enough to actually seize Quadakikl's soul and draw it into the flower, but that was okay. Zorian did not actually expect it to be able to do that. All he needed it to do was incapacitate Quadakikl for a little while, just like the chrysanthemum had done to Zack and Zorian the first time they had encountered it. The amplified soul-sizer chrysanthemum did just that. Hit by the flower's attack, Quadakikl lost control over his flight spell and plowed straight into the building in front of him before unceremoniously dropping to the ground. Being an undying Lich made out of magically reinforced bones, this high-speed impact and subsequent fall did not really hurt him much. But it did make him stationary. The defense cube behind Zorian suddenly restructured itself into a ring-shaped construct. The time-frozen spell Zorian had previously captured from Oganj was suddenly released and immediately continued its attack, this time targeting Quadakikl. The Lich shakily picked himself up from the ground, fighting off the still ongoing effects of the soul-sizer chrysanthemum through sheer willpower, and lifted his head just in time to see the giant incandescent projectile, equivalent in power to an artillery magic spell, hurling towards him. If he'd had only a few more seconds, he would have shrugged off the attack and dodged, shielded, or teleported away, but he didn't have a few more seconds. Before the projectile even reached him, the light suddenly died in his dead eye sockets and his bones started to fall back to the ground. He chose to retreat back to his phylactery on his own rather than be beaten. Moments later, the dragon magic spell hit his remains dead center, and the entire area was consumed by a blinding fireball that vaporized everything around it. As for Merva, his role in this was finished. His chest folded up again to prevent the chrysanthemum from targeting anyone else, and then he simply went limp. His internal mana reserves were gone and he could no longer move or fight. Contemptible thief! Oganj shouted in outrage, getting increasingly close. The angel tree was hot on his tail. Is your kind capable of doing anything on your own? What was he talking about? Dragons were infamous for bullying everything and everyone around them for things they wanted. Besides, you would never see a dragon build a gun or a train, so there were at least a couple of things humans invented on their own. He didn't bother saying any of this, though. He simply teleported close to the blasted site and fired a gust of wind at it, getting rid of the smoke and dust. He was met with the sight of molten ground, still visibly burning hot, with a small crater in the middle. Only one thing survived the magical conflagration: the imperial crown that once stood on Quadakikl's head, still completely untouched. Divine artifacts were not easy to destroy, especially ones of this caliber. Zorian quickly produced a force whip and used it to yank the crown towards him. He was careful not to touch it at first, but it turned out to be completely cool to the touch. He glanced to the side, where Zack and Jornak were facing off against each other. He got a little distracted while fighting Quadakikl, but at some point the mist Jornak had created completely disappeared, and the two combatants reappeared. Thankfully, Zack managed to keep Jornak from interfering, so their fellow time traveler was unable to save the Lich. They both looked pretty terrible. Zack was bleeding from his forehead and limping. Whatever Jornak had done with that mist apparently did much to even the odds between them, since Zorian did not think Jornak could hurt Zack that much in a fair fight. As for Jornak, his fancy red robe was almost entirely shredded and he was gasping for breath as if he had been running for hours, but his skin was suspiciously free of any scrapes and bruises. Zorian suspected he was similar to Silver Lake, and that any wound inflicted on him would heal quickly. Maybe not on the level of Silver Lake, since her powers seemed to focus entirely on indestructibility, while Jornak had this weird mist thing in his arsenal, but still. Zorian twirled Quatakikle's crown with his finger, giving Jornak a cheeky smile. Like that means anything, Jornak spat angrily. He hadn't taken his eyes off Zack for even a moment, but he had clearly seen Zorian's gesture. Despite what he said, the emotion in his voice told Zorian that he was very much bothered by the way things were going. This isn't over. The crown is useless to you in the short term, anyway. Before Zorian could answer, he was forced to dodge a spell from Oganj, who had finally arrived to the scene. Thankfully, the shifters and police forces had already rescued the shifter children by this point, and hurriedly left the area, so he didn't have to worry about them becoming collateral damage. Out of everyone here, I like you the least. Oganj said, slicing a nearby building in half with a blue beam of force and nearly taking Zorian's head off. You're a sleazy weakling who fights with tricks and schemes. You're allied with Silver Lake, Zorian countered. You have no room to talk. Oganj's response was a palm thrust that flattened the entire area he was standing on. Thankfully, by that point he had already teleported away to a nearby rooftop. He clacked his tongue. Though he could keep the dragon mage at bay for a while, he had to say this wasn't a good position to be in. He wasn't a heavy hitter. He couldn't tangle with Oganj for long. He mentally calculated things in his head. Should he do it now? Having Oganj around was very suboptimal, but if he had to do it now he might be able to pull it off. The dragon was busy fighting off the angel tree at the same time as fighting Zorian, so maybe. Angel, Zorian told the celestial telepathically, what are the chances of you winning against the dragon and driving him off? On my own, the angel guessed, correctly. A coin toss. How about keeping him completely busy for an hour? Zorian tried. A coin toss, the angel replied. Okay, Zorian mumbled quietly. He didn't like those odds. He glanced at the imperial crown in his hand and suddenly remembered his conversation with Silver Lake. Why was Oganj fighting them, anyway? The kingdom of Eldamar was his sworn enemy, yes, and he would no doubt love to see Scioria burn to the ground, but there was no way he just teamed up with Jornak just to see the city burn. He was promised something, and it had to be big in order to move a dragon mage of his caliber to do this. Was it bigger than a divine artifact? Let's find out. Angel, catch, Zorian sent the celestial telepathically, before throwing the crown in the sky towards the angel and accelerating it telekinetically so it could reach the celestial high in the sky. This is useless to me, the angel pointed out disapprovingly, but it humored him anyway, and quickly snatched the crown with one of its branches. I have an idea. Please play along, Zorian told it, before turning towards the dragon mage that was currently busy defending himself against the angel tree. Dragon, he shouted, I have given the angel the imperial crown. Why the hell would I care? Oganj shouted back. It can't use it. But you can. Zorian shouted back. If you agree to stop fighting us and leave the city, the angel will promise to give you the imperial crown at the end of the day. A genuine divine artifact that can increase your mana reserves. There is no other like this anywhere in the world. Oganj suddenly stopped and put some distance between himself and the angel, eyeing it speculatively. The angel hovered in place, not pursuing hostilities for the moment. Oganj, don't you dare. Jornak shouted angrily. There was a trace of panic in his voice. You know what's going to happen if you do this. Quatakikle is going to come after you. I will come after you. And you will not receive a single goddamn thing I promised you. But Oganj wasn't listening. There was a shine of greed in his eyes now, and he studied Zorian with increased focus now. You are the one who has the Imperial Orb, right? The one with the portable palace inside? Oganj suddenly asked. He didn't wait for Zorian's answer. Throw that in as well and I'll leave the city and trouble you no more. Done, Zorian said. He didn't even think twice about giving up the Imperial Orb. Losing it was painful, but his need of making the Dragon Mage go away was greater. He could always try to recover it later. He withdrew the Imperial Orb out of his pocket and threw it at the angel, accelerating it telekinetically like he did the crown. The angel caught it easily, sequestering it safely within its branches. I hereby make a promise, backed by the high heavens, that if you leave the city now and stay away from it for 24 hours, I will give you these 2 artifacts that have been entrusted to me just now, the angel told the Dragon Mage. May the high heavens strip me of my rank and strike me down should I break it. Oganj hummed appreciatively. I wouldn't trust most creatures, but an angel wouldn't. Lie. I accept. And then Oganj turned towards the northern forest in the distance and simply flew away from the city. The angel seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if it wanted to tell Zorian something, before it simply followed after the Dragon Mage. Jornak was clearly fuming with anger right now, but he still wasn't willing to quit. If anything, his attacks on Zack started getting more frenzied and reckless, his breathing harder and harder. Zorian took a deep breath. It was time. There would never be any better time than this. His mind blended with that of his simulacrums. The network of sigils he had scattered across the city sprang into life, giving him reach across the entire city. The multitude of Arania he had brought into the city, mostly quiet until now, established contact with his mind. He used a short-range teleportation spell to transport himself as close as possible to the 2 fighters. And then he lunged at both of them.